In the shadowed corridors of ancient history, where empires rise and fall like tides against weathered shores, there exists a civilization whose influence ripples through time with such profound impact that nearly every letter you read today bears their fingerprint. Yet their name has been whispered into near obscurity, their achievements scattered across the Mediterranean like fragments of purple-stained pottery waiting to be reassembled into the most remarkable story of maritime mastery the world has ever known. The Phoenicians. Master sailors who turned the Mediterranean into their personal highway. Inventors of the alphabet that would revolutionize human communication forever. Traders whose purple dye became more valuable than gold itself. These were not merely another ancient people lost to time, but the architects of connections that bound civilizations together across vast expanses of open water, creating the first truly global economy in human history. But here's what makes their story absolutely fascinating. While other great civilizations built monuments to themselves, carved their victories into stone, and erected temples that still pierce the sky today, the Phoenicians built something far more enduring. They built networks, they built systems, they built the very foundations of how we communicate, trade, and explore our world. And then, almost as if by design, they vanished into the cultural DNA of every civilization they touched. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, we're going to unravel this extraordinary tale from its very beginning. We'll trace their origins from a small fishing village on the Lebanese coast to the masters of an empire that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the edges of the known world. We'll explore how 3 city-states became the beating heart of ancient commerce, how a simple alphabet changed the course of human development, and how their legendary voyages may have taken them to places that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 1,000 years. This isn't just the story of one civilization. This is the story of how the ancient world became connected, how knowledge and goods flowed across impossible distances, and how a people who called themselves not Phoenicians, but Canaanites, became the invisible architects of our modern world. So settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin this journey across 3,000 years of history, following the wake of purple-sailed ships across wine-dark seas. Our story begins not with the crash of bronze weapons or the thunder of marching armies, but with the gentle lapping of Mediterranean waves against a crescent-shaped bay, where the Lebanon mountains cascade down to meet the eternal sea. Here, around 3200 BCE, in what would become the city of Byblos, a small community of fishermen began to notice something remarkable about the towering cedar trees that clothed the mountainsides above their modest settlement. These weren't ordinary trees. The cedars of Lebanon possessed qualities that would change the trajectory of human civilization. Their wood was virtually imperishable, resistant to rot and insects, fragrant with natural resins, and grew to enormous sizes that could provide timber for the largest construction projects. But more importantly for our fishermen, these trees could be fashioned into vessels that would carry them safely across waters that other peoples feared to traverse. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For generations, these coastal dwellers had lived much like their neighbors, sustaining themselves through fishing, small-scale farming, and the modest trade that occurred between settlements along the eastern Mediterranean coast. They were part of the broader Canaanite culture that had emerged from the complex mixing of peoples and traditions stretching back to the Neolithic period. The Canaanite roots of what would become Phoenician civilization run deep into prehistory, connecting to the Gasulian culture of the Chalcolithic period, which itself grew from the fusion of ancient Natufian and Harifian traditions with the revolutionary farming cultures of the pre-pottery Neolithic. These weren't simple hunter-gatherers, suddenly deciding to become seafarers. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of cultural development, technological innovation, and adaptive survival in one of the world's most contested regions. But it was the emergence of a powerful trading partner to the south that would catalyze their transformation from coastal villagers to maritime pioneers. Egypt, united under its early pharaohs and hungry for the resources of the wider world, discovered that the Lebanese cedar was unlike anything growing along the Nile. Here was wood that could build temples meant to last for eternity, ships capable of navigating both river and sea, and furniture worthy of divine kings. The moment that first Egyptian merchant ship appeared on the horizon of Byblos Bay, everything changed. What had been a sleepy fishing village suddenly found itself sitting atop one of the most valuable resources in the ancient world. But the transaction was not simple. The Egyptians needed the wood, but they also needed people who knew how to harvest it, transport it, and work it into the forms they required. The people of Byblos possessed not just the resource, but the knowledge, the location, and increasingly the maritime skills to deliver what the most powerful civilization of the ancient world demanded. This relationship with Egypt became the catalyst for everything that followed. Egyptian gold, silver, and exotic goods flowed north, while Lebanese cedar, along with other regional products, flowed south. But trade is never just about goods. It's about ideas, technologies, languages, and ways of seeing the world. The people of Byblos found themselves at the center of a cultural exchange that would profoundly shape their identity and capabilities. They learned Egyptian techniques for working stone and metal. They adapted Egyptian administrative methods for keeping track of complex transactions. They observed Egyptian shipbuilding methods and began to improve upon them, creating vessels that were not just functional but superior to anything else on the Mediterranean. Most importantly, they began to see the sea not as a barrier but as a highway to unlimited opportunity. The success of Byblos attracted attention from other coastal settlements. Approximately 47 miles south along the coast, the community at Sidon began to develop its own specializations and trading relationships. Sidon's location provided different advantages: a natural harbor formation that could accommodate larger vessels, access to different inland trade routes, and most significantly, coastal waters rich in a particular species of sea snail that would become the foundation of their most famous product. The murex snail, unremarkable in appearance, but extraordinary in potential, produced a secretion that could be processed into a dye of unparalleled brilliance and permanence. The process was complex, labor-intensive, and required tremendous skill to execute properly. 60,000 murex snails were needed to produce a single pound of dye, making the finished product extraordinarily expensive and therefore extraordinarily desirable to the wealthy and powerful throughout the ancient world. But Sidon's contribution to emerging Phoenician civilization extended beyond purple dye. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sidonian craftsmen may have pioneered the technique of glassblowing in the 1st century BCE, revolutionizing the production of glass vessels and making this luxury material more widely available. Their workshops became centers of innovation, where traditional techniques were constantly refined and new methods developed. The third point in this triangle of emerging maritime power was Tyre, positioned about 25 miles further south from Sidon. Tyre's geography was unique, even among the naturally advantaged coastal cities of the region. The city was built on an island just 500 to 700 meters offshore from a complementary mainland settlement called Ushu, later known as Palea Tyrus, or Old Tyre. This island location provided Tyre with extraordinary defensive advantages. Attackers could not simply march up to the walls. They had to cross open water under the observation and fire of defenders. The island itself was built upon a rocky foundation. Tyre derives from the Phoenician word esser, meaning rock, that provided a stable base for construction and natural breakwaters for the harbours. Tyre possessed not one, but 2 harbours: the Sidonian port to the north and the Egyptian port to the south. This dual harbour system allowed the city to maximise its maritime capabilities while providing redundancy in case of weather, warfare, or political complications. Ships could arrive from multiple directions and find appropriate facilities, regardless of wind conditions or the political climate with various trading partners. The positioning of these three cities created a natural progression of maritime development. Byblos had established the fundamental trading relationships and proven the viability of cedar-based commerce. Sidon had developed specialized luxury production and advanced craftsmanship. Tyre brought superior harbor facilities, defensive capabilities, and increasingly sophisticated approaches to long-distance maritime operations. But these cities were never unified under a single political authority. Unlike the great river civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, where geographic unity encouraged political centralization, the Phoenician cities remained independent city-states throughout their history. Each maintained its own government, its own patron deities, its own specific trading relationships and colonial ventures. This decentralization would prove to be both a strength and a weakness as their civilization developed. The strength lay in resilience and adaptability. If one city was threatened, the others could continue operations. Different cities could specialize in different types of trade and production without internal competition undermining efficiency. Political independence meant that trading relationships could be maintained even when one city-state found itself in conflict with a particular partner or region. The weakness would become apparent much later when unified imperial powers began to pressure the Phoenician cities. Without political unity, coordinated resistance was difficult to achieve. Each city tended to make decisions based on its own immediate interests, rather than considering the broader implications for Phoenician civilization as a whole. For now, in these early centuries of development, the independence of the city-states was pure advantage. Each could develop its own expertise and trading networks while benefiting from the overall growth of maritime commerce in the eastern Mediterranean. The foundation was being laid not just for individual urban prosperity, but for a transformation in how human societies understood distance, communication, and the possibilities inherent in connecting disparate peoples through trade. As the centuries passed and these coastal communities grew in wealth, sophistication, and maritime capability, they began to see opportunities beyond their traditional trading partners. The Mediterranean was vast, and intelligence gathered from Egyptian and Mesopotamian merchants suggested that there were peoples and resources throughout this inland sea that could benefit from the kinds of connections that the Lebanese coast had developed with the great river civilizations. The stage was set for expansion, the skills were developed, the ships were ready, the commercial networks were established. All that remained was for someone to take the first great leap into the unknown, to sail beyond the familiar coastal routes and discover what lay beyond the horizon. That leap would transform these talented coastal traders into something unprecedented in human history. The world's first truly maritime civilization, whose influence would spread across 3 continents and whose innovations would echo through 3 millennia. The transformation from coastal traders to maritime explorers required more than just courage and seaworthy vessels. It demanded a revolution in how these ancient peoples understood navigation, distance, and their place in the wider world. The breakthrough came not from a single dramatic voyage of discovery, but from the gradual accumulation of knowledge, technique, and confidence that would eventually propel Phoenician ships beyond every horizon known to the ancient world. The early expansion beyond the familiar Lebanese coastline began modestly, with trading expeditions that pushed incrementally further from home waters. Phoenician merchants discovered that the same cedarwood that had proven so valuable to the Egyptians was equally prized by the emerging Greek city-states to the west. The Greeks, engaged in their own period of rapid development and territorial expansion, needed quality timber for their temples, ships, and public buildings. But the Greeks offered something the Egyptians could not: silver. The mountains of Greece contained rich silver deposits, and Greek miners had developed sophisticated techniques for extracting and refining the precious metal. Silver was lighter than gold, easier to work, and perfect for creating the standardized units of exchange that long-distance trade required. For the first time, Phoenician merchants had access to a currency that was universally accepted throughout the Mediterranean world. This Greek connection opened pathways to markets and resources that had previously been beyond reach. Through Greek intermediaries, Phoenician goods found their way to the emerging Etruscan cities of central Italy, to the tribal peoples of the Western Mediterranean, and eventually to regions so distant that their very existence had been mythical just generations before. The technological innovations that made this expansion possible were as revolutionary as they were practical. Phoenician shipwrights had moved beyond simple adaptations of Egyptian designs to create vessels specifically engineered for Mediterranean conditions. Their ships featured deeper keels for stability in open water, larger cargo holds for extended voyages, and most importantly, sail configurations that could take advantage of the seasonal wind patterns that governed Mediterranean navigation. The Barem warship, powered by 2 banks of oars and equipped with bronze-reinforced rams, gave Phoenician expeditions the military capability to protect their trading ventures and establish permanent footholds in distant territories. But it was their merchant vessels that truly revolutionized ancient commerce. These ships could carry up to 400 tons of cargo, more than 10 times the capacity of earlier designs, making long-distance trade profitable even for relatively low-value bulk goods. Navigation remained the greatest challenge. The Mediterranean might seem small on modern maps, but to ancient sailors it was an endless expanse where a slight miscalculation could mean death by starvation or shipwreck on unknown shores. The Phoenicians solved this problem through a combination of careful observation, systematic record-keeping, and innovations that wouldn't be fully appreciated until centuries later. They were among the first to recognize that the North Star remained fixed while other celestial bodies moved across the sky, providing a constant reference point for nighttime navigation. This discovery, which they guarded as a trade secret for generations, allowed Phoenician ships to sail safely in darkness when other vessels had to seek shelter or risk running aground. Equally important was their development of coastal navigation techniques that could be applied systematically across different regions. Phoenician navigators learned to read the subtle signs that indicated proximity to land, changes in water color, the flight patterns of seabirds, the direction of swells, and the scents carried on offshore breezes. These techniques were codified into a body of practical knowledge that was passed from master to apprentice through generations of maritime families. The social structure that supported this maritime expansion was as sophisticated as the technology it employed. Phoenician society had evolved beyond the simple kinship groups that had characterized their earlier fishing village origins into complex urban communities capable of organizing and financing large-scale commercial expeditions. At the apex of each city-state stood merchant families whose wealth derived from their control of specific trade routes or commodities. These weren't just successful businessmen, they were the equivalents of modern multinational corporations, with the resources to outfit entire fleets, establish overseas operations, and maintain commercial relationships across vast distances and multiple generations. Below the merchant elite were the skilled craftsmen whose products formed the foundation of Phoenician trade. Metalworkers who could create tools and weapons superior to local production in distant markets. Textile workers who could produce fabrics of extraordinary quality and distinctive appearance. And most importantly, the shipwrights whose vessels made everything else possible. The common sailors, traders, and colonists who actually carried out the voyages and established the settlements represented a unique social class in the ancient world. These weren't slaves or conscripts, but free men who shared in the profits of successful expeditions. Many became wealthy in their own right, establishing trading posts, marrying into local populations, and creating the networks of personal relationships that made Phoenician commerce so effective. Religious practices evolved to support and sanctify this maritime lifestyle. The patron deities of each city-state took on attributes specifically related to seafaring and trade. Melkart of Tyre became associated with exploration and the establishment of new colonies. Astarte was invoked for protection during dangerous voyages. Eshmun of Sidon was credited with healing powers that could preserve crews during the diseases and injuries that plagued long-distance voyages. These religious traditions created bonds that transcended political boundaries. A Phoenician merchant from Byblos could find welcome in a temple of Melkart in the furthest western colonies because they shared common religious practices and cultural assumptions. Religion became a form of international law, providing frameworks for resolving disputes, guaranteeing the safety of merchants, and establishing the trust necessary for complex commercial relationships. The expansion phase of Phoenician civilization began in earnest around 1000 BCE, driven by population pressure, political instability in the eastern Mediterranean, and the irresistible lure of untapped markets. The island of Cyprus, visible from the Lebanese coast on clear days, became their first major overseas territory. Cyprus offered not just strategic positioning, but also substantial copper deposits and timber resources that complemented the products of the homeland. The Phoenician settlements on Cyprus established patterns that would be repeated throughout their expansion. Coastal locations with good harbours, defensible positions that could be fortified if necessary, and access to both local resources and inland trade routes. Cities like Kition became major commercial centres in their own right, serving as staging areas for expeditions further west while developing their own specialised industries and trading relationships. Success in Cyprus provided the confidence and resources for more ambitious ventures. Phoenician expeditions began probing the coasts of Anatolia, establishing trading posts along the southern shore of what is now Turkey. These settlements provided access to the rich mineral resources of the Anatolian interior, while serving as way stations for ships travelling between the eastern and western Mediterranean. The real breakthrough came with the discovery of the western Mediterranean's potential. Early expeditions, probably launched from Cyprus and the Anatolian settlements, discovered that beyond the narrow straits between Sicily and the Italian mainland lay an entire sea rich with islands, harbours, and peoples eager for the goods that Phoenician merchants could provide. Sicily itself became a major focus of Phoenician attention. The island's position made it a natural crossroads for Mediterranean trade, while its fertile soils and mineral resources offered profitable opportunities for permanent settlement. Phoenician colonies on Sicily's western coast, particularly around modern Palermo and Trapani, became major commercial centres that facilitated trade with the indigenous populations and served as bases for further exploration. The indigenous peoples of Sicily, like those encountered throughout the Mediterranean, were not primitive savages waiting to be civilized. They had their own sophisticated cultures, technologies, and trading networks. The Phoenician genius lay not in conquest or cultural imperialism, but in integration and mutual benefit. They offered goods and services that local populations wanted, while learning from local knowledge and adapting to local conditions. This pattern of cultural synthesis, rather than cultural domination, would characterize Phoenician expansion throughout their history. Unlike later imperial powers that sought to impose their own systems on conquered territories, the Phoenicians created hybrid cultures that combined their maritime and commercial expertise with local traditions and resources. From Sicily, Phoenician expeditions pushed further west, establishing settlements along the North African coast that would eventually include some of their most important and successful cities. The site that would become Carthage was selected with characteristic Phoenician attention to geographic advantage. A defensible peninsula with excellent harbours, fertile agricultural hinterland, and strategic positioning that controlled maritime traffic between the eastern and western Mediterranean. But Carthage was just one of dozens of Phoenician foundations along the North African coast. Cities like Leptis Magna, Sabratha, and Utica became major commercial centres that tapped into trans-Saharan trade routes, providing access to gold, ivory, exotic animals, and slaves from the African interior. These settlements created a chain of Phoenician-controlled ports that extended Phoenician influence far beyond what their relatively small homeland populations could have achieved through direct settlement alone. The establishment of these overseas colonies required innovations in organization and governance that were as significant as the technological advances that made the voyages possible. Phoenician colonial administration balanced the need for central coordination with respect for local autonomy and conditions. Colonies maintained religious and cultural connections with their founding cities while developing their own economic specializations and political institutions. This flexible approach to colonial governance would prove crucial to Phoenician success. Unlike rigid imperial systems that collapsed when central authority weakened, the Phoenician colonial network could adapt to changing conditions, maintain operations even when individual cities faced difficulties, and evolve in response to new opportunities and challenges. As Phoenician settlements spread across the Mediterranean, they carried with them not just goods and people, but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that would profoundly influence the development of every civilization they encountered. The networks they created became conduits for the exchange of knowledge, artistic styles, religious concepts, and most importantly, the revolutionary writing system that would transform human communication forever. The revolutionary transformation of human communication began not in the scribal schools of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphic workshops of Egypt, but in the bustling warehouses and crowded marketplaces of Phoenician trading posts scattered across the Mediterranean world. Here, merchants from dozens of different cultures struggled daily with the practical problem of recording transactions, keeping accounts, and communicating across language barriers that could make the difference between profit and catastrophe. The existing writing systems of the ancient world were marvels of intellectual achievement, but they were also monuments to complexity. Egyptian hieroglyphics required knowledge of hundreds of symbols, each representing complete concepts or syllable sounds. Mesopotamian cuneiform demanded mastery of even more intricate combinations of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. These systems worked magnificently for the priestly and administrative classes who had years to master them, but they were utterly impractical for merchants who needed to record information quickly, accurately, and in ways that could be understood by trading partners who spoke different languages. The breakthrough came from a characteristically Phoenician approach to problem solving. If something doesn't work efficiently, simplify it until it does. Rather than trying to represent complete ideas or complex syllable combinations, Phoenician scribes began experimenting with symbols that represented individual sounds, not the elaborate sound combinations that other writing systems attempted to capture, but the simple, fundamental sounds that could be combined to form any word in any language. The process wasn't sudden or systematic. It evolved through generations of practical experimentation by people whose livelihoods depended on clear, efficient communication. A Phoenician merchant recording a transaction with an Egyptian customer needed symbols that could represent both Phoenician and Egyptian words. A ship captain, preparing cargo, manifests for a voyage to Sicily, needed a system that could be quickly learned by crew members who might be recruited from half a dozen different cultures. The solution emerged around 1200 BCE in the form of 22 simple symbols, each representing a consonant sound that appeared in most Mediterranean languages. These weren't artistic masterpieces like Egyptian hieroglyphs or complex technical achievements like cuneiform wedges. They were practical tools designed by practical people to solve practical problems, and their very simplicity made them revolutionary. The symbols themselves showed clear derivation from Egyptian hieroglyphic prototypes, but they had been stripped of their decorative complexity and reduced to essential forms that could be quickly scratched into pottery, carved into stone, or painted onto papyrus. An ox head became a simple triangular form representing the sound aleph, and a house reduced to basic lines represented beth. A camel simplified to essential curves stood for gimel. What made this system truly revolutionary wasn't just its simplicity, but its universality. Unlike writing systems that were tied to specific languages or cultures, the Phoenician alphabet could represent the sounds of any spoken language. A Greek merchant could use Phoenician letters to write Greek words. A Roman administrator could employ the same symbols to record Latin. The alphabet became a universal tool for human communication, as significant an invention as the wheel or the plough. The spread of alphabetic writing followed the same routes as Phoenician trade goods, carried by the same ships and established in the same colonial settlements. Wherever Phoenician merchants established permanent trading posts, the alphabet took root and began to adapt to local languages and needs. The Greeks were among the first to recognize the system's potential, adopting Phoenician letters and adding symbols for vowel sounds to create the writing system that would record Homer's epics and Plato's philosophy. But the alphabet's influence extended far beyond literary achievement. For the first time in human history, literacy became accessible to ordinary people. A farmer could learn to read and write in weeks rather than years. A craftsman could keep his own accounts rather than relying on professional scribes. A soldier could send messages home to his family. The democratization of literacy fundamentally altered the balance of power in ancient societies, breaking the monopoly that priestly and administrative classes had maintained over written knowledge. The economic implications were equally profound. Complex commercial relationships that had previously required elaborate systems of tokens, seals, and witnesses could now be recorded in simple written contracts. Standardized weights, measures, and prices could be established and maintained across vast trading networks. Knowledge about navigation, weather patterns, and market conditions could be systematically recorded and shared rather than transmitted only through personal instruction. Religious and cultural practices evolved to incorporate this new technology. Sacred texts that had been preserved only through oral tradition could now be written down, standardized, and distributed. Legal codes could be published and made available to all citizens rather than remaining the exclusive knowledge of judges and administrators. Scientific and technical knowledge could be accumulated systematically and transmitted across generations without the inevitable distortions that accompanied purely oral transmission. The Phoenician homeland cities became centers of intellectual activity as well as commercial enterprise. Byblos, whose very name became synonymous with written material in Greek and Latin, developed into a major center for the production of papyrus scrolls and other writing materials. Scribal schools trained not just Phoenicians, but students from throughout the Mediterranean world in the techniques of alphabetic writing and record-keeping. The religious dimensions of this transformation were as significant as the practical ones. Sacred texts could now be preserved exactly as they were originally composed, without the variations that inevitably crept into oral traditions. Religious practices could be standardized across different communities and regions. Most importantly, individuals could develop personal relationships with written religious traditions rather than depending entirely on priestly intermediaries for access to sacred knowledge. The impact on Phoenician society itself was transformational. The merchant families who had built their wealth on controlling trade routes and commercial relationships found their dominance challenged by a new class of educated individuals who could read, write, and conduct business independently. Political institutions evolved to accommodate populations that were no longer dependent on traditional authorities for access to information and knowledge. Women played a particularly important role in this transformation. While formal education remained largely restricted to men, the simplicity of alphabetic writing made it possible for women to achieve literacy through informal instruction. Female merchants, particularly in the textile and luxury goods trades, became skilled in record-keeping and correspondence. Some of the earliest preserved examples of personal letters in alphabetic script were written by women managing family businesses while their husbands were away on trading expeditions. The military applications of literacy proved crucial to Phoenician expansion and survival. Written orders could be transmitted accurately across long distances. Intelligence about enemy movements and intentions could be systematically collected and analyzed. Logistical planning for large-scale military operations became possible when commanders could maintain written records of supplies, personnel, and equipment. Naval warfare, in particular, benefited enormously from the ability to create and maintain written records. Navigation instructions could be precisely recorded and shared among different ship captains. Weather patterns and seasonal conditions could be systematically documented. Most importantly, the knowledge required for maintaining and operating complex naval vessels could be preserved and transmitted through written manuals rather than relying entirely on apprenticeship and oral instruction. The development of standardized currencies and weights, facilitated by written record keeping, transformed Mediterranean commerce. Phoenician merchants could now operate with confidence in distant markets because they could rely on written contracts, standardized measurements, and systematic accounting procedures. The silver and gold that flowed through Phoenician trading networks could be accurately weighed, assayed, and recorded, creating the foundation for the sophisticated financial instruments that would characterize later periods of Mediterranean history. Colonial administration became far more efficient when governors and administrators could maintain written correspondence with their home cities. Instructions could be transmitted precisely across vast distances. Reports on local conditions, opportunities, and threats could be systematically collected and analyzed. Most importantly, the legal and administrative precedents that governed colonial relationships could be recorded and applied consistently across different territories and situations. The preservation of technical knowledge through written manuals revolutionized Phoenician craftsmanship and manufacturing. Techniques for producing the famous Tyrian purple dye could be systematically documented and transmitted to new production centers. Shipbuilding methods could be standardized and improved through written specifications and diagrams. Metallurgical processes could be refined and shared among different workshops and regions. Agricultural innovations spread rapidly through written instructions that could be adapted to different climates and soil conditions. The cultivation of new crops, the breeding of improved livestock, and the development of more efficient farming techniques could all be systematically documented and distributed throughout Phoenician territories. The emergence of historical consciousness accompanied the development of alphabetic writing. For the first time, human societies could maintain precise records of past events, analyze patterns and trends, and learn systematically from previous experiences. Phoenician historians began creating chronicles that recorded not just the deeds of kings and heroes, but the development of trade routes, the establishment of colonies, and the evolution of technological and cultural practices. These historical records served practical as well as intellectual purposes. Knowledge about past diplomatic relationships could inform current negotiations. Information about previous military campaigns could guide strategic planning. Understanding of earlier commercial successes and failures could improve decision-making about new trading ventures. The legal implications of written law transformed Phoenician society from top to bottom. Customary practices that had been transmitted through oral tradition could now be systematically codified and applied consistently. Legal procedures could be standardized across different cities and territories. Most importantly, individuals could know precisely what laws applied to their situations, rather than depending on the possibly biased interpretations of judges and administrators. Commercial law, in particular, benefited from written codification. Standardized contracts could be developed for different types of transactions. Procedures for resolving disputes could be clearly established and consistently applied. The rights and obligations of different parties in commercial relationships could be precisely defined and legally enforced. The intellectual revolution that accompanied alphabetic literacy created new forms of philosophical and scientific thinking. Complex ideas could now be systematically developed, analyzed, and debated through written texts rather than relying entirely on oral discussion and memory. Mathematical concepts could be precisely recorded and transmitted. Scientific observations could be systematically collected and compared across different regions and time periods. The artistic and cultural implications were equally profound. Literary traditions that had been preserved only through oral performance could now be written down and standardized. New forms of literary expression emerged that took advantage of the possibilities created by written language. Artistic techniques and aesthetic principles could be systematically documented and transmitted to new generations of craftsmen and artists. As alphabetic writing spread throughout the Mediterranean world through Phoenician commercial networks, it began to adapt and evolve in response to the needs of different languages and cultures. The Greeks added vowel symbols to create a more complete representation of spoken language. The Romans developed letter forms that were particularly suited to carving in stone and painting on walls. Other peoples modified the basic system to accommodate the specific sound patterns of their own languages. But regardless of these local adaptations, the fundamental principle remained unchanged. Human speech could be represented through a small number of simple symbols that could be learned quickly and used effectively by ordinary people. This principle, first developed by practical Phoenician merchants to solve practical problems of record-keeping and communication, became the foundation for all subsequent developments in human literacy and written culture. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a simple solution to the problems of Mediterranean commerce had become the basis for a revolution in human consciousness that would echo through all subsequent history. The alphabet joined the sail, the wheel, and agriculture as one of the fundamental technologies that made human civilization possible, and its Phoenician origins ensured that their influence would persist long after their political independence had vanished into the mists of ancient history. The mastery of alphabetic writing provided the Phoenicians with unprecedented organizational capabilities, but it was their revolutionary approach to maritime exploration that would truly set them apart from every other civilization of the ancient world. While other peoples hugged familiar coastlines or ventured tentatively into nearby waters, Phoenician navigators began to conceive of the Mediterranean not as a barrier to be feared, but as a highway to unlimited possibility. The transformation from coastal traders to deep-water explorers required innovations that went far beyond simple courage or improved shipbuilding techniques. It demanded a complete reconceptualization of how distance, time, and risk could be calculated and managed. Phoenician merchants began to think in terms of seasonal sailing patterns that could carry them thousands of miles from home while still returning with profitable cargoes before winter storms made navigation impossible. The key breakthrough came with their systematic study of wind patterns and current flows throughout the Mediterranean basin. Unlike earlier navigators who had been content to wait for favorable conditions, Phoenician captains began to predict and exploit the regular seasonal changes that governed Mediterranean weather. They discovered that the Etesian winds that blew from the northwest during summer months could carry heavily loaded vessels from the Levantine coast to the western Mediterranean in a matter of weeks. More importantly, they learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when these seasonal patterns were about to shift. Changes in water temperature, the behavior of marine life, the direction of high-altitude clouds, and even the intensity of morning dew all provided information that experienced navigators could use to plan their voyages with remarkable precision. The development of standardized sailing seasons transformed Phoenician commerce from a series of individual ventures into a coordinated system of interconnected operations. Spring departures from the homeland cities carried manufactured goods, cedar products, and luxury items to Western markets. Summer months were spent trading, establishing new contacts, and loading return cargoes. Autumn voyages brought precious metals, raw materials, and exotic products back to the eastern Mediterranean before winter weather made sailing too dangerous to attempt. This systematic approach to long-distance navigation required new forms of commercial organization that could coordinate activities across vast distances and extended time periods. Merchant families began to establish permanent representatives in distant ports, creating networks of agents who could prepare cargoes, arrange local transportation, and negotiate with indigenous populations during the months when direct communication with the homeland was impossible. These overseas representatives weren't simply employees or temporary factors. They became integral parts of extended family enterprises that operated across multiple generations and dozens of different markets. Sons and nephews were sent to establish themselves in promising locations, often intermarrying with local populations to create permanent bonds between Phoenician commercial interests and indigenous communities. The social structures that emerged from this system were unlike anything that had previously existed in the ancient world. Phoenician merchants operating in distant territories needed to balance loyalty to their homeland cities with adaptation to local customs and conditions. They developed a unique form of cultural flexibility that allowed them to function effectively in radically different social environments while maintaining their distinctive identity and commercial practices. Religious practices evolved to support these extended networks of commercial relationships. Temples dedicated to Phoenician deities were established in every major trading center, serving not just as places of worship, but as community centers where merchants could meet, exchange information, and resolve disputes according to familiar legal and cultural traditions. The Temple of Melkart in Gades, founded according to tradition in 1104 BCE, became a focal point for Phoenician activities throughout the Western Mediterranean. Merchants traveling to Spain could find sanctuary, conduct business according to Phoenician law, and participate in religious ceremonies that reinforced their cultural identity despite being thousands of miles from home. These religious institutions served crucial practical functions beyond their spiritual significance. Temple priests maintained commercial records, stored valuable goods, and provided banking services that enabled complex financial transactions across enormous distances. A merchant in Tyre could deposit silver with the local temple of Astarte, receive a written receipt, and use that document to claim equivalent value from the temple of Astarte in Carthage months later. The expansion of Phoenician commercial networks created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer. Ideas, artistic styles, and technical innovations spread rapidly along trade routes that connected disparate civilizations across 3 continents. Phoenician merchants became the primary conduits through which the achievements of one culture could influence and enrich others. Egyptian medical knowledge reached Celtic tribes in Spain through Phoenician intermediaries. Mesopotamian astronomical observations were transmitted to Greek scholars through Phoenician-controlled ports. Innovative metallurgical techniques developed in one region were rapidly disseminated to craftsmen working thousands of miles away, creating a level of technological diffusion that wouldn't be matched again until the modern era. The cumulative effect of these exchanges was to accelerate the pace of human development throughout the Mediterranean world. Civilizations that had previously evolved in relative isolation suddenly gained access to the accumulated knowledge and innovations of dozens of other cultures. The result was an explosion of creativity and achievement that transformed every aspect of human life, from agriculture and craftsmanship to philosophy and artistic expression. Phoenician colonial settlements served as laboratories where different cultural traditions could be combined and refined. The city of Motia in Sicily brought together Phoenician maritime expertise, indigenous Sicilian agricultural knowledge, and Greek artistic influences to create a unique hybrid culture that was more sophisticated and productive than any of its individual components. Similar synthesis occurred throughout the Phoenician colonial world. Carthaginian agriculture combined Phoenician irrigation techniques with North African crop varieties and Egyptian farming methods to create agricultural systems capable of supporting much larger populations than had been possible using traditional methods alone. The political implications of this cultural synthesis were equally significant. Phoenician colonies developed governmental systems that balanced respect for local traditions with the need for effective administration and defense. Indigenous populations were integrated into colonial societies, not as conquered subjects, but as partners in mutually beneficial commercial enterprises. This inclusive approach to colonial governance created unusually stable and prosperous settlements that could survive and thrive even when their connections to the homeland were disrupted by war or political upheaval. Carthage, originally established as a Tyrian trading post, eventually became more powerful and influential than Tyre itself, demonstrating the success of Phoenician colonial methods. The military innovations that accompanied Phoenician expansion were as revolutionary as their commercial and administrative achievements. Traditional ancient warfare had been dominated by heavily armed infantry formations fighting in close combat. But Phoenician military doctrine emphasized mobility, naval supremacy, and the coordination of diverse forces recruited from throughout their commercial networks. Phoenician armies were typically smaller than those of their enemies, but they were also more flexible and better equipped. Professional soldiers served alongside allied troops recruited from colonial populations and indigenous allies. This diversity of military traditions created tactical capabilities that could adapt to widely different combat situations and enemy strategies. Naval warfare became a Phoenician specialty that other Mediterranean powers struggled to match. Their warships combined speed, maneuverability, and firepower in ways that gave them decisive advantages in most maritime encounters. The development of the ram as a primary naval weapon allowed Phoenician vessels to sink enemy ships without the need for costly and dangerous boarding actions. More importantly, Phoenician naval doctrine emphasized the coordination of multiple vessels in complex tactical formations. Fleet actions became sophisticated chess games, where positioning, timing, and communication were more important than individual ship capabilities. This systematic approach to naval warfare would influence Mediterranean military thinking for centuries to come. The logistical systems that supported Phoenician military operations were as advanced as their tactical innovations. Supply chains extending across thousands of miles enabled Phoenician forces to maintain extended campaigns in distant territories. Standardized equipment and training procedures allowed forces recruited from different regions to fight effectively together, despite their diverse cultural backgrounds. Intelligence gathering became a crucial component of Phoenician military success. Their extensive commercial networks provided unparalleled access to information about enemy movements, political developments, and economic conditions throughout the Mediterranean world. Merchants and colonial administrators served as informal intelligence agents, reporting on developments that might affect Phoenician interests. The integration of commercial and military activities created synergies that multiplied Phoenician effectiveness in both areas. Trading expeditions could gather intelligence about potential military targets, while military campaigns opened new territories for commercial exploitation. Colonial settlements served simultaneously as trading posts, naval bases, and intelligence-gathering centers. The technological innovations that emerged from this integration of commercial and military activities included improvements in shipbuilding, navigation, metallurgy, and siege warfare that advanced the state-of-the-art throughout the ancient world. Phoenician engineers developed new techniques for constructing harbors, fortifications, and other infrastructure projects that enabled their settlements to prosper in challenging environments. The famous harbor at Carthage, with its circular military port connected to a larger commercial harbor, represented the pinnacle of ancient naval architecture. The facility could accommodate over 200 warships, while providing secure anchorage for hundreds of merchant vessels, creating a naval base that was both impregnable and economically productive. Similar engineering achievements characterized Phoenician settlements throughout the Mediterranean. Artificial harbors carved from solid rock, aqueduct systems that brought fresh water across dozens of miles, and fortification systems that could withstand prolonged sieges demonstrated the technical capabilities that made Phoenician expansion possible. The agricultural innovations that supported these urban centers were equally impressive. Phoenician colonists developed new crops adapted to Mediterranean climates, improved irrigation techniques that maximized productivity in arid regions, and livestock breeding programs that created animals better suited to local conditions. The famous horses of North Africa, bred in Carthaginian stables from stock originally imported from various Mediterranean regions, became renowned throughout the ancient world for their speed, endurance, and intelligence. These animals provided Carthaginian cavalry with decisive advantages in numerous military campaigns, while generating substantial profits through export to other Mediterranean powers. Wine production became another Phoenician specialty that combined agricultural innovation with commercial expertise. Vineyards established in favorable locations throughout the Mediterranean produced wines that were traded across vast distances, creating luxury markets that generated enormous profits while spreading Phoenician cultural influence. The development of standardized amphora designs for wine transport demonstrates the systematic approach that Phoenicians brought to every aspect of their commercial operations. These ceramic containers were precisely sized to maximize cargo capacity while minimizing breakage during transport. Their distinctive shapes became instantly recognizable throughout the Mediterranean, serving as advertisements for Phoenician wine quality. The artistic achievements that flourished within Phoenician commercial networks reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized their civilization. Craftsmen working in Phoenician cities and colonies had access to raw materials, techniques, and aesthetic traditions from throughout the known world, enabling them to create works that combined the best elements of multiple artistic traditions. Phoenician metalwork became particularly renowned for its technical excellence and aesthetic sophistication. Gold and silver jewelry produced in Phoenician workshops displayed influences from Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek artistic traditions, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that marked them as uniquely Phoenician products. The famous Phoenician bowls, decorated with intricate scenes that combined mythological themes from different cultures, were prized throughout the ancient world as symbols of wealth and sophisticated taste. These objects served not just as luxury goods, but as vehicles for transmitting artistic ideas and cultural concepts across vast distances. Textile production represented another area where Phoenician cultural synthesis created products of exceptional quality and distinctive character. The famous purple dye that gave the Phoenicians their Greek name was just one element in a sophisticated textile industry that combined fibers, dyes, and weaving techniques from throughout the Mediterranean world. Phoenician textiles were prized not just for their beauty, but for their technical quality. Fabrics woven in Phoenician workshops retained their colors longer, wore better under harsh conditions, and displayed patterns of exceptional complexity and precision. These qualities made Phoenician textiles valuable trade goods, while establishing technical standards that influenced textile production throughout the ancient world. The architectural achievements of Phoenician cities reflected the same synthesis of practical functionality with aesthetic excellence that characterized their other cultural productions. Buildings were designed not just to serve their immediate purposes, but to demonstrate the wealth, sophistication, and cultural achievements of the communities that created them. The temples, palaces, and public buildings of major Phoenician cities combined architectural elements from multiple traditions to create distinctive styles that were both beautiful and practical. Massive stone foundations provided stability and permanence, while decorative elements demonstrated the artistic capabilities of local craftsmen and the cultural connections that linked Phoenician cities to the broader Mediterranean world. Urban planning became a Phoenician specialty that influenced city development throughout their colonial territories. The systematic layout of streets, the provision of adequate water supplies, the integration of commercial and residential areas, and the creation of public spaces that could accommodate large gatherings all demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the requirements for urban life. The legacy of these urban planning innovations can still be seen in the ruins of Phoenician cities throughout the Mediterranean. The regularity of street layouts, the efficiency of drainage systems, and the careful integration of different urban functions created cities that were both beautiful and functional, providing models that would influence Mediterranean urban development for centuries to come. As Phoenician civilization reached its maturity during the first millennium BCE, it had created something unprecedented in human history, a truly international culture that transcended political boundaries, ethnic divisions, and geographical barriers. Their networks of trade, cultural exchange, and technological diffusion had transformed the Mediterranean from a collection of isolated regional cultures into an interconnected world where ideas, goods, and innovations could spread with unprecedented speed and efficiency. The stage was now set for the greatest achievements and the greatest challenges that Phoenician civilization would face, as the networks they had created attracted the attention of emerging imperial powers, who recognized both the value and the vulnerability of a commercial empire that depended on trade rather than conquest, cooperation rather than domination, and cultural synthesis rather than cultural imperialism. The networks that bound together this remarkable commercial empire would soon face their greatest test, as the rise of imperial powers in Mesopotamia cast long shadows across the eastern Mediterranean. The year 868 BCE marked a turning point that few Phoenicians could have anticipated, when the armies of Ashurnasurpal-Isu first reached the Mediterranean coast and gazed upon the purple-sailed ships that had become symbols of prosperity and independence throughout the ancient world. The Assyrian Empire, built upon military conquest and territorial expansion, represented everything that Phoenician civilization was not. Where the Phoenicians had created wealth through trade and cooperation, the Assyrians accumulated power through conquest and tribute. Where Phoenician cities maintained independence while participating in voluntary commercial networks, Assyrian territories were absorbed into a centralized imperial system that brooked no deviation from imperial will. The initial encounter between these radically different approaches to civilization was deceptively peaceful. Ashurnasurpal's forces, having completed their campaigns against inland territories, arrived at the coast not as conquerors, but as customers. The Assyrian war machine required vast quantities of resources that their homeland could not provide: cedar wood for siege engines and palace construction, purple dye for royal garments, silver and gold for paying mercenaries, and the countless luxury goods that demonstrated imperial power and sophistication. The Phoenician cities, viewing this development through their characteristic lens of commercial opportunity, welcomed the Assyrians as potentially valuable trading partners. Here was a wealthy and powerful customer with seemingly unlimited resources and an appetite for exactly the kinds of goods that Phoenician merchants specialized in providing. Initial transactions proceeded smoothly, with both sides apparently satisfied with the arrangements. But the Assyrian approach to international relations recognized no distinction between trade partners and subject peoples. What began as voluntary commercial exchange gradually transformed into demanded tribute, backed by the implicit threat of military consequences for those who failed to comply. The Phoenician cities found themselves caught between their traditional independence and the growing realization that refusal to meet Assyrian demands could result in the destruction of everything they had built. The transformation was gradual enough that it could be rationalized as simply the cost of doing business with a powerful partner. Annual payments of silver, gold, and luxury goods could be justified as investments in maintaining access to lucrative Assyrian markets. The presence of Assyrian officials in Phoenician ports could be explained as necessary for facilitating complex international transactions. Yet each concession established precedents that made the next demand more difficult to refuse. Assyrian advisors began influencing Phoenician political decisions. Assyrian military units appeared in Phoenician territories, ostensibly for protection against common enemies, but obviously capable of enforcement activities if circumstances required. The independence that had characterized Phoenician civilization for centuries was being eroded through a process so gradual that resistance seemed both futile and economically self-destructive. The reign of Shalmaneser III intensified these pressures through a more systematic approach to extracting resources from Phoenician territories. The Assyrian king understood that the wealth of the coastal cities derived not from their immediate territories, but from their extensive commercial networks. Control over Phoenician trade routes could provide the Assyrian Empire with access to resources from throughout the Mediterranean world without the expense and difficulty of direct conquest. Assyrian administrators began studying Phoenician commercial practices with the same systematic attention that Assyrian generals devoted to siege warfare. They mapped trade routes, analyzed profit margins, and identified the key choke points where imperial control could maximize revenue extraction while minimizing administrative costs. The result was a system of managed exploitation that preserved Phoenician commercial capabilities while directing their benefits toward Assyrian imperial purposes. The psychological impact of this gradual subjugation was perhaps more devastating than direct military conquest would have been. Phoenician merchants, who had prided themselves on their independence and commercial acumen, found themselves reduced to the status of imperial tax collectors, responsible for extracting wealth from their own trading networks for the benefit of foreign overlords. Traditional relationships between Phoenician cities and their trading partners became strained as commercial exchanges were increasingly dictated by Assyrian political considerations rather than mutual economic benefit. Colonial settlements that had been established through voluntary cooperation began to resemble outposts of an imperial system that prioritized resource extraction over local development. The cultural implications of Assyrian dominance extended far beyond economic exploitation. Phoenician religious practices came under scrutiny from Assyrian administrators who viewed local deities and traditions as potential sources of resistance to imperial authority. Temples were required to acknowledge Assyrian gods alongside traditional Phoenician deities, while religious festivals were modified to include celebrations of Assyrian military victories and imperial achievements. The famous purple dye industry became a particular focus of Assyrian attention, not just because of its economic value, but because of its symbolic significance. Purple had become associated throughout the ancient world with Phoenician identity and independence. Assyrian control over purple production sent clear messages about the transfer of power from Phoenician merchants to Assyrian administrators. Production quotas were established that prioritized Assyrian needs over traditional commercial relationships. Quality standards were imposed that reflected Assyrian preferences rather than market demands. Most significantly, the distribution of purple-dyed goods was increasingly controlled by Assyrian officials who used access to these luxury items as tools for managing relationships with other client states and potential enemies. The shipbuilding industry faced similar pressures as Assyrian military planners recognized the strategic value of Phoenician maritime expertise. Traditional commercial vessels were modified to serve military purposes, while shipyards were required to produce warships according to Assyrian specifications. The knowledge and skills that had made Phoenician navigation superior to that of other Mediterranean peoples were systematically catalogued and transmitted to Assyrian naval commanders. These changes fundamentally altered the character of Phoenician maritime activities. Ships that had once carried goods to voluntary trading partners now transported tribute to imperial storehouses. Navigational knowledge that had been carefully guarded as commercial secrets was shared with Assyrian officials, who used it to extend imperial control over previously inaccessible territories. The administrative systems that had evolved to support Phoenician commercial networks were gradually adapted to serve Assyrian imperial purposes. Record-keeping practices that had been developed for tracking complex commercial transactions were modified to monitor tribute collection and resource extraction. Communication networks that had facilitated coordination between distant trading posts were used to transmit imperial orders and gather intelligence about potential resistance activities. The transformation of Phoenician society under Assyrian rule was most evident in the changing composition of urban populations. Traditional merchant families found their influence diminished as Assyrian administrators assumed control over major commercial decisions. Craftsmen who had previously worked for diverse international markets were increasingly required to focus on products demanded by imperial customers. New social classes emerged to serve Assyrian administrative needs. Interpreters and cultural intermediaries became essential for managing relationships between Assyrian officials and Phoenician populations. Accountants and record keepers were needed to maintain the detailed documentation that imperial bureaucracy required. Military specialists were recruited to serve in Assyrian forces while maintaining knowledge of local conditions and capabilities. The educational systems that had developed to support Phoenician commercial activities were modified to serve imperial requirements. Schools that had taught navigation, languages, and commercial practices began emphasizing administrative skills, military training, and imperial history. The alphabet that had been developed to facilitate international trade became a tool for transmitting Assyrian laws, regulations, and cultural values throughout the empire. Religious education was particularly affected by these changes. Traditional Phoenician religious practices were maintained, but they were increasingly supplemented by instruction in Assyrian religious traditions and imperial ideology. Young Phoenicians learned to participate in both local and imperial religious ceremonies, creating hybrid cultural identities that reflected their complex political situation. The colonial territories that had been established through Phoenician expansion faced even greater challenges as Assyrian influence extended throughout the Mediterranean. Settlements that had been founded as independent trading posts found themselves incorporated into an imperial system that prioritized strategic control over commercial development. Colonial governors, who had previously been accountable to their founding cities, were increasingly required to report to Assyrian administrators, who might have little understanding of local conditions or traditional practices. Decision-making processes that had been based on commercial considerations and mutual benefit were modified to reflect imperial priorities and strategic objectives. The indigenous populations that had been integrated into Phoenician colonial societies through voluntary cooperation found their status increasingly uncertain under Assyrian rule. Relationships that had been based on mutual benefit and cultural exchange were replaced by hierarchical arrangements that reflected imperial concepts of dominance and subordination. Trade relationships that had developed over centuries were disrupted as Assyrian administrators imposed new regulations, taxation systems, and political requirements. Commercial partnerships that had been based on trust and mutual understanding were strained by the introduction of imperial oversight and control. The technological innovations that had made Phoenician expansion possible continued to develop under Assyrian rule, but their applications were increasingly directed toward imperial rather than commercial purposes. Advances in metallurgy were applied to weapons production rather than trade goods. Improvements in navigation were used to extend imperial control rather than facilitate commercial exchange. The artistic traditions that had flourished under Phoenician patronage were modified to serve imperial propaganda purposes. Craftsmen who had previously created works celebrating Phoenician achievements and cultural values were required to produce items that glorified Assyrian military victories and imperial power. Religious art became a particular focus of imperial attention, as Assyrian administrators recognized the importance of visual symbols in shaping cultural identity and political loyalty. Traditional Phoenician religious imagery was gradually supplemented and sometimes replaced by representations of Assyrian deities and imperial themes. The literary traditions that had emerged from Phoenician cultural synthesis faced similar pressures. Historical narratives that had celebrated Phoenician exploration and commercial achievement were modified to emphasize Assyrian contributions and imperial benefits. Legal texts were rewritten to reflect Assyrian law while maintaining enough local content to ensure popular acceptance. The preservation of traditional knowledge became increasingly problematic as imperial priorities took precedence over local interests. Technical manuals that had been developed to support Phoenician industries were modified to serve imperial needs. Commercial records that had documented the development of international trade networks were analyzed for their strategic and economic intelligence value. Despite these pressures, Phoenician communities found ways to maintain essential elements of their cultural identity while adapting to imperial requirements. Family networks that had been established to support commercial activities were used to preserve traditional practices and knowledge. Religious institutions continued to serve as centers of cultural continuity, even as they incorporated imperial elements. The resilience that had enabled Phoenicians to adapt to diverse cultural environments throughout the Mediterranean served them well in adapting to Assyrian rule. Their characteristic flexibility and pragmatism enabled them to find ways of preserving what was most important to them, while making the accommodations necessary for survival under imperial domination. Underground networks developed to maintain connections between Phoenician communities that had been separated by imperial administrative boundaries. Coded messages were embedded in commercial correspondence to communicate information that imperial censors might find objectionable. Traditional festivals and religious ceremonies were modified to serve as vehicles for maintaining cultural solidarity while avoiding direct confrontation with imperial authority. The economic impact of Assyrian rule was complex and contradictory. While imperial tribute requirements reduced the resources available for traditional Phoenician commercial activities, integration into the Assyrian Empire provided access to new markets and resources that had previously been inaccessible. Some Phoenician merchants found ways to profit from serving as intermediaries between imperial administrators and local populations. The construction projects that Assyrian rule required throughout their territories created demands for exactly the kinds of skilled labor and specialized materials that Phoenician communities were uniquely qualified to provide. Palace construction, temple building, and military fortification projects required cedar wood, skilled stoneworkers, and decorative materials that Phoenician suppliers could provide more efficiently than anyone else. Military campaigns that extended Assyrian control into new territories created opportunities for Phoenician merchants to establish trading relationships in previously inaccessible regions. The security that imperial control provided along major trade routes reduced the risks associated with long-distance commerce, while imperial standardization of weights, measures, and currencies simplified commercial transactions. Yet these benefits came at the cost of the independence and cultural autonomy that had made Phoenician civilization distinctive. The networks that had been created through voluntary cooperation were being transformed into imperial administrative systems. The cultural synthesis that had characterized Phoenician societies was being replaced by imperial uniformity. The long-term implications of these changes would not become fully apparent until the Assyrian Empire itself began to show signs of weakness and decline. The systems that had been established to extract resources from Phoenician territories had created dependencies that would prove difficult to modify when circumstances changed. The administrative structures that had been developed to serve imperial purposes had displaced traditional institutions that would be needed to restore independent governance. Most significantly, the generation of Phoenicians that had grown up under Assyrian rule had been educated and trained to serve imperial rather than commercial purposes. Their skills and knowledge, while valuable, were oriented toward maintaining existing systems rather than creating new ones. The entrepreneurial spirit and innovative thinking that had made original Phoenician expansion possible had been channeled into serving imperial objectives rather than pursuing independent opportunities. As Assyrian power reached its zenith during the 7th century BCE, few observers could have predicted that this seemingly invincible empire would soon face its own existential challenges. The very success that had enabled Assyrian expansion had created problems that would prove increasingly difficult to manage. The tribute system that had enriched the imperial treasury had also created economic dependencies that made the empire vulnerable to disruptions in resource flows. The administrative burden of governing diverse populations across vast territories was straining imperial resources and capabilities. The military commitments required to maintain control over reluctant subjects were consuming increasing proportions of imperial revenue. Most significantly, the imperial ideology that justified Assyrian rule was generating resistance movements that would eventually coalesce into effective opposition forces. For the Phoenicians, trapped within this imperial system, but retaining memories of their independent past. The approaching crisis would present both dangers and opportunities. The collapse of Assyrian power would create the possibility of restored independence, but it would also expose them to new threats from other emerging imperial powers. The skills and networks that they had preserved despite centuries of foreign domination would once again become crucial for their survival and success. The stage was being set for a new chapter in Phoenician history, one that would test their ability to rebuild what had been lost while adapting to fundamentally changed circumstances. The commercial networks that had made their original expansion possible had been disrupted but not destroyed. The cultural traditions that had defined their identity had been suppressed but not eliminated. The maritime expertise that had given them their initial advantages remained intact despite decades of imperial control. Most importantly, the alphabet that they had given to the world continued to spread throughout the Mediterranean, carrying with it the possibility of renewed cultural exchange and commercial cooperation. As imperial systems based on conquest and domination began to show their inherent limitations, the Phoenician model of voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit would once again prove its enduring value. The death throes of the Assyrian Empire began not with a single dramatic collapse, but with the slow hemorrhaging of resources and authority that inevitably accompanies imperial overextension. By the late 7th century BCE, the very systems that had made Assyrian dominance possible were consuming more resources than they generated, creating cascading failures that would ultimately liberate the Phoenician cities from centuries of foreign control. The rebellion that erupted in Babylon during 626 BCE sent shockwaves throughout the imperial system, demonstrating that even the most thoroughly subjugated populations could successfully challenge Assyrian authority when circumstances aligned in their favor. The emergence of Nabopolassar as an independent Babylonian king created a precedent that encouraged resistance movements throughout the empire, while simultaneously depriving the Assyrians of one of their most valuable tributary territories. For the Phoenician cities, these developments represented both opportunity and danger in equal measure. The weakening of Assyrian control created possibilities for restored independence, but it also removed the imperial protection that had shielded them from other regional powers. The delicate balance that had enabled Phoenician communities to preserve their essential character while serving imperial purposes was about to be shattered by forces beyond their control. The alliance between the rebellious Babylonians and the emerging Median Empire created a military coalition capable of challenging Assyrian supremacy directly. When these combined forces launched their assault on the Assyrian heartland, the imperial administration was forced to recall troops and resources from peripheral territories to defend the core of their empire. This retrenchment provided Phoenician cities with their first taste of genuine autonomy in over 2 centuries. The response varied significantly among the different Phoenician centers, reflecting the diverse ways in which Assyrian rule had affected their individual development. Tyre, which had maintained the strongest commercial networks despite imperial restrictions, moved quickly to re-establish independent trading relationships and assert control over its traditional maritime territories. Sidon, whose industries had been more thoroughly integrated into imperial systems, faced greater challenges in adapting to sudden independence. The northern cities, particularly those that had been most exposed to direct Assyrian administrative control, found themselves caught between competing loyalties and uncertain about their future political alignment. Some attempted to maintain their relationships with weakened Assyrian authorities, hoping that imperial power might be restored. Others threw their support behind emerging regional powers that seemed to offer better prospects for long-term security and prosperity. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE effectively ended Assyrian hopes of maintaining their empire, but it also established a new imperial power that would prove equally challenging for Phoenician independence. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II, inherited not only Assyrian territories, but also Assyrian attitudes toward the management of subject populations. The Babylonian approach to governing the Phoenician cities combined elements of Assyrian administrative methods with innovations that reflected their own imperial priorities and cultural values. Like their predecessors, the Babylonians recognized the economic value of Phoenician commercial networks and sought to extract maximum benefit from these resources. However, their methods were more sophisticated and in some ways more intrusive than those employed by the Assyrians. Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Tyre, which lasted 13 years according to contemporary accounts, represented a fundamental shift in imperial strategy toward the Phoenician cities. Rather than relying primarily on tribute extraction and administrative oversight, the Babylonians sought to establish direct control over Phoenician territories and populations. The siege was not merely a military operation, but a comprehensive economic and psychological campaign designed to break the will of the most independent-minded Phoenician city. The duration and intensity of this siege demonstrated both the determination of Babylonian imperial policy and the remarkable resilience of Phoenician defensive capabilities. Tyre's island location, which had provided security for centuries, enabled the city to withstand Babylonian assault while maintaining limited commercial operations through its maritime connections. The siege became a test of endurance between imperial power and commercial ingenuity. The partial success of Tyrian resistance had profound implications for Phoenician relations with the Babylonian Empire. While the city was not destroyed and suffered relatively limited physical damage, the economic and demographic costs of the siege were enormous. The disruption of normal commercial activities for more than a decade devastated the networks that had sustained Tyrian prosperity, while the constant threat of assault forced massive expenditures on defensive preparations. More significantly, the siege demonstrated that even the most defensible Phoenician positions could be threatened by imperial powers willing to commit sufficient resources to extended operations. The psychological impact of this realization affected Phoenician strategic thinking throughout their territories, encouraging a more cautious approach to imperial relations and a greater emphasis on accommodation rather than resistance. The Babylonian administrative system that emerged from these conflicts reflected lessons learned from both Assyrian precedents and the specific challenges of governing Phoenician territories. Babylonian officials developed more sophisticated methods for monitoring and controlling commercial activities while providing greater apparent autonomy to local populations. This approach proved more effective than crude coercion in extracting resources while minimizing the costs of imperial administration. Religious policies under Babylonian rule demonstrated similar sophistication in balancing imperial requirements with local sensitivities. Rather than simply imposing Babylonian religious practices, imperial administrators encouraged syncretistic developments that incorporated traditional Phoenician deities into broader Mesopotamian religious frameworks. This approach reduced the potential for religious resistance while facilitating the cultural integration that made imperial rule more stable and efficient. The deportation policies that had characterized late Assyrian administration were modified under Babylonian rule to focus on removing key leadership groups while preserving the skilled populations that made Phoenician territories economically valuable. Rather than wholesale population transfers, the Babylonians employed selective relocations that disrupted potential resistance networks while maintaining the human resources necessary for continued economic productivity. These policies had complex effects on Phoenician society and culture. The removal of traditional leadership groups created opportunities for new elites to emerge, often individuals who had collaborated with imperial authorities or demonstrated particular skills in navigating the complex requirements of imperial service. These new leaders brought different perspectives and priorities that gradually altered the character of Phoenician communities. The skilled craftsmen, merchants, and navigators who remained in Phoenician territories found themselves operating within increasingly constrained circumstances. While their expertise was valued and rewarded by imperial administrators, their activities were directed towards serving imperial rather than independent commercial objectives. The creative and entrepreneurial spirit that had characterized earlier Phoenician development was channeled into maintaining existing systems rather than creating new opportunities. Colonial territories that had been established during the period of Phoenician independence faced particular challenges under Babylonian rule. Settlements that had been founded as autonomous trading posts were gradually integrated into imperial administrative systems that prioritized resource extraction over local development. The voluntary relationships that had characterized earlier colonial arrangements were replaced by hierarchical structures that reflected imperial concepts of dominance and control. The impact of these changes was most evident in the Western Mediterranean, where Phoenician colonies had developed their own distinctive identities and capabilities during centuries of independent development. Cities like Carthage, which had grown from modest trading posts into major commercial centers, found themselves increasingly isolated from their eastern homeland as Babylonian policies disrupted traditional communication and support networks. This isolation had contradictory effects on Western Phoenician development. On one hand, the disruption of traditional relationships with homeland cities forced colonial communities to become more self-reliant and innovative in addressing their local challenges and opportunities. On the other hand, the loss of the technical knowledge, cultural traditions, and commercial connections that had been maintained through regular contact with the East created gaps that were difficult to fill through local resources alone. The emergence of Carthage as an independent power during this period reflected both the opportunities and the necessities created by the disruption of traditional Phoenician networks. The city's leadership, recognizing that they could no longer depend on support from Tyre or other eastern cities, began developing their own imperial ambitions and capabilities that would eventually surpass those of their founding cities. Carthaginian expansion into the interior of North Africa, their establishment of control over key Mediterranean islands, and their development of independent relationships with other Western Mediterranean peoples demonstrated the adaptive capabilities that had always characterized Phoenician civilization. However, these developments also represented a fundamental departure from traditional Phoenician approaches to territorial and commercial expansion. Where earlier Phoenician expansion had been based on voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit, Carthaginian imperialism increasingly resembled the conquest-based systems that had been employed by Assyrian and Babylonian empires. The city developed professional military forces, imposed tributary relationships on subject populations, and established administrative systems designed to extract resources from controlled territories. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE created new opportunities and challenges for Phoenician communities throughout the Mediterranean. The policies of Cyrus the Great and his successors represented a significant departure from earlier imperial approaches, emphasizing cultural tolerance and administrative flexibility rather than uniformity and control. The incorporation of Phoenician territories into the Persian Empire as part of the Fifth Satrapy provided a framework for restored autonomy that had not existed under previous imperial systems. Persian administrators, recognizing the economic value of Phoenician commercial networks, actively encouraged the restoration of traditional trading relationships and the development of new commercial opportunities that would benefit both local communities and the imperial treasury. The Persian approach to governing diverse populations proved particularly well suited to Phoenician social and cultural characteristics. Rather than attempting to impose uniform administrative systems, Persian officials adapted their methods to local conditions and traditions. This flexibility enabled Phoenician communities to restore many of their traditional practices while fulfilling their obligations to imperial authority. Religious policies under Persian rule demonstrated similar sensitivity to local traditions and requirements. The Persian Empire's policy of supporting the restoration of traditional religious practices and institutions provided opportunities for Phoenician communities to revive cultural traditions that had been suppressed or modified under earlier imperial systems. The reconstruction of temples, the restoration of traditional festivals, and the revival of local religious practices contributed to a broader cultural renaissance that strengthened Phoenician identity while maintaining loyalty to Persian imperial authority. This balance between cultural autonomy and political integration represented one of the most successful approaches to imperial governance developed in the ancient world. Economic policies under Persian rule actively encouraged the restoration and expansion of Phoenician commercial activities. Rather than viewing trade networks as potential sources of resistance, Persian administrators recognized them as valuable assets that could contribute to imperial prosperity while maintaining regional stability. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies throughout the Persian Empire facilitated long-distance commerce while reducing the transaction costs that had previously limited the scope of international trade. Persian investment in road construction, harbor facilities, and communication systems created infrastructure that supported commercial expansion while serving imperial administrative needs. The revival of Phoenician maritime activities under Persian patronage led to unprecedented expansion of their trading networks. Persian resources and protection enabled Phoenician expeditions to venture into previously inaccessible territories, while Persian demand for luxury goods and exotic materials provided profitable markets for new commercial ventures. The famous voyage of Hanno, which may have carried Carthaginian explorers around the western coast of Africa, demonstrates the scale of maritime ambitions that Persian rule made possible. Similarly ambitious expeditions explored the Atlantic coastlines of Europe and Africa, establishing trading posts and gathering intelligence about resources and peoples that had been unknown to earlier Mediterranean civilizations. These explorations expanded human knowledge of global geography, while creating new opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer. The accounts of these voyages, preserved in various ancient sources, provide evidence of Phoenician navigational capabilities and commercial ambitions that rivaled those of much later periods of European exploration. The integration of Phoenician expertise with Persian resources created synergies that benefited both parties while contributing to the broader development of ancient civilization. Persian imperial administration gained access to maritime capabilities and commercial knowledge that enhanced their ability to govern diverse populations across vast territories. Phoenician communities recovered the autonomy and resources necessary to pursue their traditional activities while serving imperial objectives. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this collaboration combined the best elements of both traditions while creating new forms of artistic, intellectual, and technological achievement. Persian artistic traditions influenced Phoenician craftsmanship, while Phoenician commercial practices enhanced Persian administrative efficiency. Educational institutions that developed during this period combined Persian administrative training with traditional Phoenician commercial and navigational instruction. The result was a generation of individuals capable of functioning effectively in both local and imperial contexts, while maintaining the cultural knowledge necessary for preserving Phoenician identity. The stability and prosperity that characterized Phoenician territories under Persian rule created conditions favorable for intellectual and cultural development. The restoration of libraries, the revival of literary traditions, and the encouragement of scholarly activities contributed to a renaissance that preserved ancient knowledge while creating new forms of cultural expression. Historical writing flourished during this period as Phoenician scholars gained access to Persian royal archives while maintaining their own cultural traditions and perspectives. The synthesis of different historical traditions created new forms of historical consciousness that influenced Mediterranean intellectual development for centuries to come. Scientific and technical knowledge also benefited from the cultural exchange that Persian rule facilitated. Phoenician navigational expertise combined with Persian astronomical observations to create more accurate methods for determining position and direction during long-distance voyages. Similarly, Phoenician commercial practices were enhanced by Persian administrative techniques and mathematical knowledge. The medical traditions that developed during this period combined Phoenician knowledge of maritime health challenges with Persian medical theory and practice. The result was a more comprehensive understanding of disease prevention and treatment that proved particularly valuable for maintaining the health of crews during extended voyages. Agricultural innovations that emerged from this collaboration improved the productivity of Phoenician territories while creating new export opportunities for Persian markets. The introduction of new crops, improved irrigation techniques, and better livestock breeding practices increased agricultural output while diversifying economic activities. The architectural achievements of this period reflected the synthesis of Persian imperial grandeur with Phoenician practical functionality and aesthetic sensibilities. Public buildings, constructed during Persian rule, combined monumental scale with sophisticated engineering and beautiful decorative programs that demonstrated the prosperity and cultural sophistication of Phoenician communities. Harbour facilities constructed during this period represented particular achievements in combining Persian resources with Phoenician maritime expertise. The expansion and improvement of existing ports, combined with the construction of new facilities in strategic locations, created infrastructure that supported increased commercial activity while serving Persian military and administrative needs. The road networks that connected Phoenician cities to broader Persian communication systems facilitated both commercial and administrative activities while creating new opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer. These transportation improvements reduced the costs and risks associated with long-distance trade while enabling more effective coordination of activities across vast territories. The legal systems that developed during Persian rule combined traditional Phoenician commercial law with Persian administrative procedures to create frameworks for resolving disputes and regulating activities that served both local and imperial interests. These hybrid legal systems provided models for governing diverse populations that would influence legal development throughout the ancient world. As Persian rule matured during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the Phoenician territories within the empire had achieved a level of prosperity and cultural sophistication that rivaled their achievements during the period of independence. The combination of restored autonomy with imperial resources and protection had created conditions favorable for economic growth, cultural development, and territorial expansion. Yet this prosperity existed within a framework of imperial dependency that would prove vulnerable to the political and military challenges that the Persian Empire would face during its final centuries. The Phoenician cities had recovered much of their traditional character and capabilities, but they had also become integrated into imperial systems that they could not control or significantly influence. The approaching confrontation between Persian imperial power and the emerging Macedonian kingdom under Alexander the Great would test these relationships in ways that neither Persian administrators nor Phoenician leaders could have anticipated. The military innovations and strategic ambitions that Alexander brought to his campaigns against the Persian Empire would challenge traditional approaches to warfare, diplomacy, and imperial administration throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. For the Phoenicians, caught between their loyalty to Persian authority and their vulnerability to Macedonian military power, the coming crisis would force difficult choices about political alignment, military resistance, and cultural survival. The networks they had rebuilt under Persian protection would once again face disruption, while the autonomy they had recovered would be threatened by new forms of imperial control that proved far more intrusive than anything they had previously experienced. The stage was set for another transformation in Phoenician history, one that would test their characteristic adaptability against challenges that would prove more fundamental and lasting than any they had previously confronted. The commercial networks, cultural traditions, and maritime expertise that had enabled them to survive previous imperial transitions would be crucial assets in navigating the complexities of the Hellenistic world that Alexander's conquests would create. The arrival of Alexander of Macedon on the shores of Asia Minor in 334 BCE represented more than another imperial succession. It marked the beginning of a cultural transformation that would fundamentally alter the character of Mediterranean civilization itself. Unlike previous conquerors who had sought to extract resources or impose administrative control, Alexander brought with him a vision of cultural synthesis that would challenge the very foundations of how ancient peoples understood identity, governance, and their place in an interconnected world. The young Macedonian king's approach to conquest differed radically from the methodical campaigns that had characterized earlier imperial expansion, where Assyrian and Persian armies had moved systematically from one objective to the next, consolidating control before advancing further. Alexander's forces swept across territories with unprecedented speed and audacity. This velocity of conquest created opportunities and challenges that no previous generation of Phoenician leaders had been required to navigate. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE became the defining moment that would determine not only the fate of the most important Phoenician city, but the future relationship between Phoenician civilization and the Hellenistic world that Alexander's victories were creating. The city's resistance to Macedonian demands represented more than simple defiance of a conqueror. It embodied the fundamental tension between Phoenician concepts of negotiated accommodation and Alexander's vision of absolute submission to his personal authority. Tyre's island location, which had provided security against countless previous attackers, became the focus of an engineering project that demonstrated the revolutionary approach Alexander brought to military challenges. Rather than accepting the limitations imposed by geography, Macedonian engineers began constructing a causeway that would connect the island to the mainland, eliminating the natural defensive barrier that had protected the city for centuries. The construction of this causeway required resources and organizational capabilities that exceeded anything previously attempted in ancient warfare. Thousands of workers labored to transport stone, timber, and earth across difficult terrain, while defending themselves against constant attacks from Tyrian naval forces. The project consumed months of effort and enormous quantities of materials, demonstrating Alexander's willingness to invest whatever resources were necessary to achieve his objectives. The psychological impact of this engineering achievement extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The gradual transformation of an island fortress into a peninsular settlement sent unmistakable messages about the permanence of Macedonian intentions and the futility of traditional defensive strategies. Other cities throughout the region could observe the inexorable progress of construction and draw their own conclusions about the wisdom of continued resistance. The fall of Tyre, after 7 months of siege, marked the end of Phoenician independence in its original homeland, and established precedents for Hellenistic governance that would influence Mediterranean political development for centuries. The destruction was comprehensive and deliberate, designed not merely to eliminate resistance, but to demonstrate the consequences of defying Macedonian authority. The survivors of the siege faced choices that reflected the broader dilemma confronting Phoenician communities throughout their territories. Those who could demonstrate valuable skills or knowledge found opportunities within the expanding Macedonian administrative system, often achieving positions of responsibility and influence that exceeded what had been possible under Persian rule. Others faced enslavement or exile, their traditional lives disrupted by the violent transformation of their homeland. The dispersal of Tyrian population throughout Alexander's conquests had profound implications for the transmission of Phoenician cultural traditions and technical knowledge. Skilled craftsmen, navigators, and merchants found themselves scattered across territories stretching from Egypt to Central Asia, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries of maritime civilization. These displaced populations became inadvertent agents of cultural diffusion, introducing Phoenician techniques and perspectives into regions that had previously been beyond the reach of Mediterranean commercial networks. Their expertise in navigation, shipbuilding, and long-distance trade proved valuable to Hellenistic rulers seeking to consolidate control over their diverse territories while developing new forms of economic organization. The adaptation of Phoenician commercial practices to serve Hellenistic imperial objectives created hybrid systems that combined traditional Mediterranean trading methods with the administrative innovations that characterized Alexander's successors. The result was an expansion of commercial networks that exceeded anything achieved during the classical period, connecting regions that had previously existed in relative isolation. Alexandria in Egypt became a focal point for this synthesis of Phoenician commercial expertise with Hellenistic imperial resources. The city's location at the mouth of the Nile provided access to African trade routes, while its Mediterranean harbours connected it to the broader network of Hellenistic territories. Phoenician merchants and navigators played crucial roles in establishing the commercial relationships that made Alexandria one of the most prosperous cities of the ancient world. The library and museum at Alexandria became repositories for the accumulated knowledge of conquered civilizations, including the navigational techniques, geographical understanding, and commercial practices that Phoenicians had developed through centuries of Mediterranean exploration. This systematic preservation of knowledge represented a departure from earlier approaches to cultural conquest that had emphasized replacement rather than integration. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that Phoenician navigators had accumulated through practical experience was combined with Greek theoretical approaches to create new forms of scientific understanding. The result was more accurate methods for determining position and direction during long-distance voyages, enabling expeditions to venture into previously inaccessible territories with greater confidence and safety. The influence of Phoenician artistic traditions on Hellenistic cultural development is evident in the decorative programs of buildings constructed throughout Alexander's former territories. The synthesis of Greek architectural principles with ornamental traditions derived from Phoenician and other Eastern cultures created distinctive regional styles that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Hellenistic civilization. Coinage developed during the Hellenistic period demonstrates similar cultural synthesis, combining Greek portrait traditions with symbolic elements derived from various conquered cultures. The standardization of monetary systems throughout Hellenistic territories facilitated long-distance trade, while the incorporation of diverse cultural symbols reflected the multicultural character of these new political entities. The religious syncretism that characterized Hellenistic civilization owed much to the cultural flexibility that had always distinguished Phoenician approaches to dealing with diverse populations. The identification of local deities with Greek gods followed patterns that Phoenicians had employed for centuries in their commercial relationships with different Mediterranean peoples. Mystery religions that flourished throughout the Hellenistic world incorporated ritual elements and theological concepts derived from various Eastern traditions, including Phoenician religious practices that had been transmitted through displaced populations. These synthetic religious movements reflected the cosmopolitan character of Hellenistic urban centers, while providing spiritual frameworks that could accommodate diverse cultural backgrounds. The emergence of Carthage as an independent imperial power during the Hellenistic period represented the most successful adaptation of Phoenician political traditions to the challenges created by Alexander's conquests. The city's leadership, recognizing that they could no longer depend on connections with their eastern homeland, developed their own approaches to territorial expansion and imperial administration. Carthaginian military organization reflected lessons learned from observing Hellenistic warfare, while maintaining distinctive elements derived from traditional Phoenician practices. The integration of diverse military traditions created forces capable of challenging even the most sophisticated opponents, while preserving the cultural identity that distinguished Carthaginian civilization from its competitors. The agricultural innovations that supported Carthaginian expansion demonstrated the application of accumulated Phoenician knowledge to new environmental challenges. Irrigation techniques developed for Mediterranean climates were adapted to North African conditions, while crop varieties were selected and bred to maximize productivity in different geographical settings. Urban planning in Carthaginian territories reflected the synthesis of traditional Phoenician approaches with innovations learned through contact with other Mediterranean civilizations. The result was cities that combined practical functionality with aesthetic appeal, while providing the infrastructure necessary for supporting large populations and complex commercial activities. The naval capabilities that enabled Carthaginian expansion represented the culmination of centuries of Phoenician maritime development, enhanced by resources and technologies acquired through contact with Hellenistic civilization. Carthaginian warships incorporated design innovations that maximized both fighting effectiveness and operational flexibility, while maintaining the seaworthiness that had always characterized Phoenician vessels. The commercial networks that supported Carthaginian prosperity extended throughout the Western Mediterranean and beyond, reaching territories that had been unknown to earlier Phoenician explorers. These trading relationships created wealth that funded military expansion while providing access to resources and materials that enhanced Carthaginian technological and cultural development. The legal systems that governed Carthaginian territories combined traditional Phoenician commercial law with administrative innovations derived from various Mediterranean legal traditions. The result was a sophisticated framework for managing diverse populations while maintaining the efficiency and flexibility that complex commercial operations required. Educational institutions in Carthaginian territories preserved traditional Phoenician knowledge while incorporating new forms of learning derived from contact with Greek and other Mediterranean cultures. The synthesis of practical commercial training with theoretical Greek education created individuals capable of functioning effectively in the cosmopolitan environment that characterized the Hellenistic world. The preservation of Phoenician cultural traditions within Carthaginian society demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that had always characterized this civilization. Religious practices, artistic traditions, and social customs were maintained and transmitted across generations, while adapting to new circumstances and influences. The expansion of Carthaginian influence into the interior of Africa opened new frontiers for exploration and commercial development that exceeded anything achieved during earlier periods of Phoenician history. Expeditions reached territories that would not be accessible to Mediterranean civilization again for centuries, establishing trading relationships and gathering knowledge about resources and peoples that remained largely unknown to other ancient civilizations. The artistic achievements of Carthaginian civilization reflected the synthesis of traditional Phoenician aesthetic principles with influences derived from contact with various Mediterranean cultures. Sculptures, paintings, and decorative objects produced in Carthaginian workshops demonstrated technical excellence while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected their cultural origins. The architectural monuments constructed in Carthaginian territories combined practical functionality with symbolic significance, creating buildings that served immediate needs while expressing the cultural values and imperial ambitions of their builders. These structures provided models for urban development that influenced construction practices throughout the Western Mediterranean. The technological innovations that emerged from Carthaginian workshops and laboratories advanced the state of the art in various fields, while maintaining the practical orientation that had always characterized Phoenician approaches to technical challenges. Improvements in metallurgy, shipbuilding, and agricultural techniques enhanced productivity while creating new opportunities for commercial and military expansion. The diplomatic relationships that Carthage established with other Mediterranean powers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international politics and strategic balance. These relationships provided security against potential enemies while creating opportunities for beneficial cooperation in areas of mutual interest. The military campaigns that extended Carthaginian control throughout the Western Mediterranean tested the effectiveness of their hybrid military organization while creating precedents for imperial administration that would influence subsequent political developments. These conflicts provided experience in coordinating diverse forces while adapting to different tactical challenges and strategic environments. The emergence of Rome as a competing imperial power in the Western Mediterranean created challenges for Carthaginian expansion that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The clash between these two imperial systems represented more than simple territorial competition. It embodied fundamental differences in approaches to governance, military organization, and cultural integration that would determine the future character of Mediterranean civilization. The Punic Wars that resulted from this competition tested every aspect of Carthaginian society and revealed both the strengths and limitations of the political and military systems that had evolved from traditional Phoenician practices. The outcome of these conflicts would determine not only the fate of Carthage, but the survival of Phoenician civilization as a distinctive cultural force in the ancient world. The final destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE marked the end of Phoenician political independence, but not the complete elimination of their cultural influence. The knowledge, traditions, and innovations that they had developed through centuries of Mediterranean expansion continued to influence ancient civilization through the various channels of cultural transmission that they had established. The Roman victory in the Punic Wars represented the triumph of a different approach to imperial organization and cultural integration, one that emphasized uniform administration and cultural assimilation rather than the flexible accommodation that had characterized Phoenician practices. Yet even Roman imperial systems incorporated elements derived from Phoenician innovations, particularly in areas related to commerce, navigation, and urban administration. The legacy of Phoenician civilization extended far beyond the political boundaries of their territories or the chronological limits of their independence. The alphabet they had developed continued to evolve and spread throughout the ancient world, becoming the foundation for literacy in cultures that had no direct contact with Phoenician merchants or settlers. The commercial practices they had pioneered provided models for long-distance trade that influenced economic development throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The navigational techniques they had perfected enabled subsequent explorers to venture into previously unknown territories with greater confidence and safety. The cultural synthesis they had achieved in their various territories demonstrated possibilities for peaceful cooperation among diverse populations that would continue to inspire political thinkers and administrators throughout antiquity and beyond. Their example showed that prosperity and cultural achievement could be built on voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit rather than conquest and domination. As the last Phoenician cities lost their distinctive identity through assimilation into Roman imperial culture, the final chapter of their independent existence came to a close. Yet the influence they had exerted on Mediterranean civilization during their centuries of prominence continued to shape human development in ways that would persist long after their political independence had become merely a memory preserved in ancient historical texts. The networks they had created, the knowledge they had accumulated, and the innovations they had developed had become integral parts of the broader stream of human cultural development. Their contribution to that stream ensured that their influence would continue even as their distinctive identity dissolved into the larger synthesis of ancient Mediterranean civilization. The twilight of Phoenician political independence coincided with the rise of a Mediterranean power whose approach to empire building would prove fundamentally incompatible with the commercial networks and cultural flexibility that had sustained Phoenician civilization for over a millennium. Rome, emerging from its modest origins as a city-state on the Italian peninsula, represented a radically different vision of how diverse populations could be organized, governed, and integrated into a unified political system. Where Phoenician expansion had been driven by commercial opportunity and voluntary cooperation, Roman growth followed the inexorable logic of military conquest and territorial annexation. Where Phoenicians had created networks of semi-autonomous trading partners linked by mutual benefit, Romans constructed hierarchical administrative systems that demanded complete submission to imperial authority. These contrasting approaches to expansion and governance made conflict inevitable once Roman ambitions extended beyond the Italian mainland. The first encounters between Roman and Phoenician forces occurred not through deliberate imperial policy, but through the complex web of alliances and obligations that characterized Mediterranean politics during the 3rd century BCE. The island of Sicily, with its strategic position controlling maritime traffic between the eastern and western Mediterranean, became the focal point for a struggle that would ultimately determine which civilization would dominate the ancient world. The Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized control of the Sicilian city of Messana, found themselves trapped between hostile neighbors and facing extinction unless they could secure outside assistance. Their simultaneous appeals to both Rome and Carthage for protection created the diplomatic crisis that would escalate into the first comprehensive test of strength between the two emerging imperial systems. The Roman decision to intervene in Sicily represented a dramatic departure from their traditional policy of limiting expansion to the Italian mainland. The strategic implications of allowing Carthaginian control over Sicily, with its potential threat to Roman shipping in southern Italian territories, convinced the Roman Senate that their security required active involvement in Mediterranean power politics. The Carthaginian response reflected the mature imperial thinking that had evolved from centuries of territorial expansion and diplomatic experience. The city's leadership recognized that Roman intervention in Sicily threatened not merely their immediate interest in the region, but the entire network of commercial and political relationships that sustained their Western Mediterranean empire. The outbreak of hostilities in 264 BCE marked the beginning of what would become known as the First Punic War, a conflict that would test every aspect of both civilizations and reveal the fundamental differences in their approaches to military organization, strategic planning, and the mobilization of imperial resources. The early phases of the conflict demonstrated the respective strengths and weaknesses that each side brought to the struggle. Carthaginian forces possessed superior naval capabilities, extensive experience in coordinating diverse military units, and access to resources drawn from throughout their commercial empire. Roman armies displayed the disciplined infantry tactics that had proven effective in Italian campaigns, superior siege techniques, and the organizational capacity to sustain prolonged military operations. The adaptation of Roman military methods to naval warfare represented one of the most remarkable achievements in ancient military history. Recognizing that their traditional tactical advantages were meaningless without the ability to project power across water, Roman engineers developed innovative solutions that transformed naval combat from a contest of seamanship into an extension of land-based infantry fighting. The development of the corvus, a boarding bridge that could lock onto enemy vessels and allow Roman legionaries to fight on familiar terms, demonstrated the creative problem-solving that characterized Roman approaches to military challenges. This technological innovation neutralized Carthaginian advantages in ship handling and navigation, while exploiting Roman superiority in close combat and unit cohesion. The Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE provided the first decisive test of these innovations and established Roman credibility as a naval power capable of challenging Carthaginian dominance of Mediterranean waters. The victory demonstrated that technological innovation combined with tactical adaptation could overcome centuries of accumulated maritime expertise when applied with sufficient determination and resources. The extension of the conflict beyond Sicily into Africa represented Roman strategic thinking at its most ambitious and revealed the global scope that the struggle had assumed. The expedition led by Marcus Atilius Regulus in 256 BCE aimed not merely to relieve pressure on Roman forces in Sicily, but to strike at the heart of Carthaginian power and force a decisive conclusion to the war. The initial success of Roman forces in Africa demonstrated the effectiveness of their military organization when deployed in unfamiliar environments, while also revealing the limitations of traditional Carthaginian defensive strategies when confronted by determined and well-organized opponents. The systematic reduction of Carthaginian strongholds and the advance toward Carthage itself created panic within the city and forced fundamental reassessments of military strategy and imperial priorities. The Carthaginian response to this crisis involved innovations that would influence Mediterranean warfare for generations. The recruitment of Spartan military advisors, particularly Xanthippus, brought new tactical concepts and training methods that enhanced the effectiveness of traditional Carthaginian forces while addressing the weaknesses that Roman successors had revealed. The Battle of Tunis in 255 BCE marked the turning point that demonstrated the continued viability of Carthaginian military power when properly organized and equipped. The destruction of Regulus's expedition and the capture of the Roman commander himself provided Carthage with both strategic relief and valuable propaganda advantages that helped restore morale throughout their territories. The prolonged nature of the conflict extending over 23 years, tested the endurance and resources of both civilizations while revealing the depth of their commitment to achieving decisive victory. Neither side possessed sufficient advantages to secure rapid triumph, creating a war of attrition that consumed enormous quantities of human and material resources while transforming both societies in fundamental ways. The economic burden of sustained military operations, forced innovations in financial organization and resource mobilization that influenced subsequent imperial development. Roman taxation systems evolved to support unprecedented military expenditures, while Carthaginian commercial networks were redirected to serve military rather than purely commercial purposes. The social consequences of prolonged warfare affected every level of both societies, creating new classes of military professionals while disrupting traditional occupations and relationships. Veterans of extended campaigns brought new perspectives and expectations that influenced domestic politics and social organization throughout the post-war period. The technological developments that emerged from competitive military innovation accelerated progress in shipbuilding, metallurgy, and siege warfare that advanced the general level of Mediterranean military capabilities. Improvements in armor, weapons, and fortification techniques developed during the conflict were rapidly disseminated throughout the ancient world through commercial and diplomatic networks. The conclusion of the First Punic War in 241 BCE established Roman dominance over Sicily while leaving fundamental questions about Mediterranean supremacy unresolved. The peace terms imposed on Carthage, including the payment of massive indemnities and restrictions on military activities, created resentments and economic pressures that made future conflict virtually inevitable. The interim period between the First and Second Punic conflicts witnessed the development of new strategic concepts and military capabilities that would characterize the resumed struggle. Carthaginian expansion into Spain provided access to mineral resources and manpower that enabled the reconstruction of military forces while creating new theatres for potential Roman-Carthaginian competition. The emergence of the Barcid family as the dominant force in Carthaginian politics represented a fundamental shift toward more aggressive and militaristic approaches to imperial competition. Hamilcar Barca's campaigns in Spain established the economic and military foundations for renewed conflict, while his sons, particularly Hannibal, developed the strategic concepts that would bring the war to Roman territory itself. The Roman response to Carthaginian expansion in Spain reflected growing confidence in their military capabilities, combined with increasing concern about Carthaginian recovery and potential for renewed aggression. The establishment of Roman alliances with Spanish tribes and the founding of new Roman settlements created competing spheres of influence that made territorial conflict inevitable. The siege of Saguntum in 219 BCE provided the immediate cause for renewed hostilities while demonstrating the sophisticated siege techniques that Carthaginian forces had developed during their Spanish campaigns. The city's destruction, despite its alliance with Rome, sent clear messages about Carthaginian determination to eliminate Roman influence from territories they considered essential to their imperial interests. The outbreak of the Second Punic War represented the culmination of strategic planning that had been developing for decades within Carthaginian military and political circles. Unlike the reactive policies that had characterized their response to Roman expansion during the first conflict, Carthaginian strategy for the renewed war involved carefully coordinated operations designed to exploit Roman vulnerabilities while maximizing Carthaginian advantages. Hannibal's decision to march overland from Spain to Italy represented strategic thinking of unprecedented audacity and demonstrated the global perspective that now characterized Mediterranean power competition. The crossing of the Alps with a diverse army, including war elephants, required logistical capabilities and organizational skills that rivaled any military achievement in ancient history. The psychological impact of Hannibal's arrival in Italy exceeded even its immediate military significance, demonstrating that Roman territory was not invulnerable and that the warfare which had previously been confined to distant theatres could directly threaten the Roman heartland. The panic that gripped Roman populations reflected their recognition that traditional defensive strategies were inadequate against enemies capable of such unprecedented strategic mobility. The series of tactical victories that marked Hannibal's early campaigns in Italy established his reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders, while revealing the limitations of traditional Roman military doctrine when confronted by superior tactical innovation and strategic thinking. The battles of Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae demonstrated the effectiveness of flexible tactical systems that could adapt to specific battlefield conditions while exploiting enemy weaknesses. The Battle of Cannae, in particular, became a masterpiece of tactical innovation that influenced military thinking throughout subsequent history. The double envelopment that destroyed the largest Roman army ever assembled demonstrated the possibilities inherent in coordinating diverse military units while maintaining tactical flexibility and strategic initiative. The Roman response to these catastrophic defeats revealed the institutional resilience that would ultimately prove decisive in determining the war's outcome. Rather than seeking immediate peace or abandoning their imperial ambitions, Roman leadership adopted new strategic approaches that avoided direct confrontation while systematically undermining Carthaginian advantages through alternative means. The Fabian strategy of attrition and indirect warfare represented a fundamental shift in Roman military thinking that acknowledged tactical inferiority while exploiting strategic advantages in resources and organizational capacity. The systematic avoidance of major battles combined with constant pressure on Carthaginian supply lines and allied relationships gradually eroded the advantages that tactical brilliance had initially provided. The extension of the conflict into Spain and other theatres demonstrated Roman strategic thinking at its most sophisticated, recognizing that victory required not merely defeating Carthaginian armies, but eliminating the sources of Carthaginian power and the networks that sustained their imperial system. The campaigns led by Scipio Africanus in Spain systematically dismantled Carthaginian control while building Roman influence among indigenous populations. The development of new Roman tactical systems that could compete effectively with Carthaginian innovations demonstrated the learning capacity and adaptive flexibility that characterized Roman military culture at its best. The reforms that produced more flexible legion organization and improved coordination between different military units enabled Roman forces to fight effectively against opponents whose tactical sophistication had previously given them decisive advantages. The eventual Roman victory in the Second Punic War established not merely military supremacy, but cultural and political dominance that would reshape Mediterranean civilization for centuries. The peace terms imposed on Carthage in 201 BCE effectively eliminated the city as an independent imperial power while establishing Roman hegemony over the entire Mediterranean basin. The destruction of Carthaginian naval capabilities and the restrictions placed on their military activities ensured that future challenges to Roman dominance would have to come from other sources. The massive indemnities imposed on the defeated city provided Rome with resources for further expansion while crippling Carthaginian capacity for economic recovery and political resurgence. The final chapter in the Carthaginian story began not with military aggression, but with the internal prosperity that marked the city's remarkable recovery during the decades following their decisive defeat. Despite the crushing terms imposed after the Second Punic War, Carthaginian merchants and administrators had demonstrated the resilience that had always characterized their civilization, rebuilding their economy and restoring their city to a level of wealth that began to concern their Roman masters. This recovery, achieved through purely commercial means and conducted within the strict limitations imposed by Roman treaty terms, represented a final demonstration of the economic capabilities that had made Carthaginian civilization possible. The city's traders, operating without military protection or imperial territories, had managed to create prosperity through the same skills in navigation, commerce, and cultural adaptation that had originally built their empire. Yet this very success became a source of Roman anxiety. as influential voices within the Roman Senate began to argue that any Carthaginian recovery represented a potential threat to Roman security. The famous declaration of Cato the Elder, who allegedly ended every speech with the words, "Carthage must be destroyed," reflected a growing consensus that only the complete elimination of their former rivals could guarantee Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 BCE, represented not a conflict between equals, but a systematic campaign of annihilation directed against a city whose only crime had been its success in recovering from previous defeats. The Roman forces that laid siege to Carthage possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and strategic position that made the outcome inevitable from the conflict's beginning. The 3-year siege that preceded Carthage's final destruction tested the endurance and courage of defenders who understood that they were fighting not for victory, but for survival. The systematic reduction of the city's defenses, the starvation of its population, and the eventual assault that overwhelmed its final resistance demonstrated Roman military efficiency at its most ruthless and comprehensive. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE was deliberate and complete, designed not merely to eliminate a rival, but to erase the physical evidence of a civilization that had challenged Roman supremacy. The systematic demolition of buildings, the slaughter or enslavement of the entire population, and the legendary cursing of the site ensured that nothing would remain to inspire future resistance to Roman authority. The symbolic significance of Carthage's destruction extended far beyond its immediate military and political consequences. The elimination of the last independent Phoenician state marked the end of a form of civilization that had offered an alternative to Roman concepts of imperial organization and cultural integration. The scattering of Carthaginian survivors throughout Roman territories completed the process of cultural absorption that had been occurring gradually throughout Phoenician lands for centuries. Those who escaped the destruction carried with them fragments of traditional knowledge and cultural practices, but they lacked the institutional frameworks and territorial bases necessary to maintain distinct Phoenician identity. The integration of former Carthaginian territories into Roman administrative systems eliminated the last vestiges of Phoenician political organization, while transforming the economic relationships that had sustained their commercial networks. Roman colonists replaced Carthaginian populations, while Roman laws and customs displaced traditional Phoenician practices. The transformation of Carthaginian harbors into Roman naval facilities symbolized the complete transfer of Mediterranean dominance from one civilization to another. The engineering works that had made Carthage a great naval power were adapted to serve Roman strategic purposes, while the knowledge that had created them was absorbed into Roman military and administrative systems. The preservation of certain Carthaginian innovations within Roman imperial practice demonstrated the practical value of Phoenician contributions to ancient civilization, even as their political independence was eliminated. Roman agriculture incorporated techniques developed in Carthaginian territories, while Roman commerce adopted practices that had originated in Phoenician trading networks. The linguistic legacy of Phoenician civilization survived its political destruction through the continued use of Punic in North African territories under Roman rule. This persistence of traditional language reflected the deep cultural roots that Phoenician settlers had established throughout their territories, roots that proved difficult to eliminate even through systematic Romanization policies. The archaeological evidence of Phoenician settlement patterns and urban organization influenced Roman colonial development throughout North Africa and other former Carthaginian territories. The practical advantages of Phoenician approaches to harbor construction, urban planning, and agricultural organization were too valuable to abandon simply because of their origins. The artistic traditions that had flourished under Carthaginian patronage continued to influence Mediterranean cultural development through the craftsmen and artists who survived the destruction and found employment within Roman cultural institutions. The synthesis of diverse artistic traditions that had characterized Phoenician civilization provided models for the cosmopolitan culture that emerged throughout the Roman Empire. The religious syncretism that had enabled Phoenician communities to adapt to diverse cultural environments found new expression within Roman religious systems that proved equally flexible in accommodating different traditions and practices. The mystery religions that flourished throughout the Roman Empire incorporated elements derived from various sources, including Phoenician religious traditions transmitted through displaced populations. The commercial practices that had made Phoenician expansion possible continued to influence Mediterranean trade through the Roman merchants and administrators who had learned these techniques through contact with Phoenician traders and colonial communities. The standardization of weights, measures, and currencies that facilitated Roman imperial commerce reflected principles that had been pioneered by Phoenician merchants centuries earlier. The navigational knowledge that had enabled Phoenician exploration of the Mediterranean and beyond was preserved and transmitted through the Roman naval forces that inherited control of former Phoenician territories. The sailing directions, harbour descriptions, and weather observations that Phoenician navigators had accumulated through centuries of experience became valuable resources for Roman maritime operations. The agricultural innovations that had enabled Carthaginian territories to support large populations and generate substantial surpluses were studied and adapted by Roman colonists seeking to maximize the productivity of their new territories. The crop varieties, irrigation techniques, and farming methods developed in Phoenician settlements provided practical solutions to challenges that Roman agriculture encountered in similar environmental conditions. The urban planning principles that had governed the construction of Phoenician cities influenced Roman colonial development throughout the Mediterranean world. The integration of commercial, residential, and religious areas within carefully planned urban environments provided models for Roman city builders seeking to create efficient and attractive settlements. The legal traditions that had evolved within Phoenician commercial networks contributed to the development of Roman commercial law through the merchants and administrators who had experience with both systems. The contractual arrangements, dispute resolution procedures, and regulatory frameworks that had governed Phoenician trade provided precedents for Roman legal innovations that facilitated imperial commerce. The educational methods that had preserved and transmitted Phoenician cultural traditions influenced Roman approaches to training administrators and military personnel for service in diverse territories. The linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and practical experience that Phoenician educational systems had developed provided models for Roman institutions seeking to prepare personnel for imperial service. The diplomatic practices that had enabled Phoenician cities to maintain relationships with diverse Mediterranean peoples contributed to Roman techniques for managing complex international relationships. The negotiation methods, treaty arrangements, and alliance systems that had sustained Phoenician expansion provided precedents for Roman diplomatic initiatives throughout their expanding empire. The technological innovations that had emerged from Phoenician workshops and laboratories continued to influence Mediterranean development through the craftsmen and engineers who had acquired this knowledge through apprenticeship and practical experience. The metallurgical techniques, construction methods, and manufacturing processes that had been developed to serve Phoenician needs found new applications within Roman imperial systems. The preservation of Phoenician historical records and geographical knowledge within Roman libraries and archives ensured that future generations would have access to information about territories, peoples, and resources that had been gathered through centuries of Phoenician exploration and commerce. These records became valuable resources for Roman military campaigns and colonial ventures in previously unexplored territories. The cultural synthesis that had characterized Phoenician civilization at its height provided models for the cosmopolitan culture that emerged throughout the Roman Empire as diverse populations were integrated into imperial systems. The flexibility and adaptability that had enabled Phoenicians to succeed in radically different environments demonstrated principles that Roman administrators applied throughout their expanding territories. As the last traces of independent Phoenician political organization disappeared into Roman imperial systems, the influence of their civilization continued through the countless channels of cultural transmission that they had established during their centuries of Mediterranean dominance. The networks they had created, The innovations they had developed and the knowledge they had accumulated had become integral parts of the broader stream of ancient Mediterranean development. The alphabet they had perfected continued to evolve and spread throughout the Roman world and beyond, becoming the foundation for literacy in cultures that had no memory of its Phoenician origins. The commercial practices they had pioneered provided frameworks for economic relationships that persisted long after their political independence had been eliminated. The navigational techniques they had developed enabled subsequent explorers to venture into unknown territories with confidence based on accumulated Phoenician experience. The urban planning principles, agricultural innovations, and technological developments that had made Phoenician expansion possible continued to influence Mediterranean civilization through the Roman systems that inherited and adapted these achievements. The cultural flexibility and commercial acumen that had distinguished Phoenician civilization provided models for successful adaptation to diverse environments and changing circumstances. The religious tolerance and cultural synthesis that had characterized Phoenician approaches to governing diverse populations influenced Roman imperial policies that sought to maintain stability while accommodating different traditions and practices. The diplomatic flexibility and commercial orientation that had sustained Phoenician networks provided precedents for Roman approaches to managing complex international relationships. The educational traditions that had preserved and transmitted Phoenician knowledge across generations contributed to the intellectual foundations of Roman civilization through the scholars, administrators, and craftsmen who carried this knowledge into new institutional contexts. The literary traditions, historical consciousness, and technical expertise that had flourished under Phoenician patronage found new expression within Roman cultural frameworks. As Roman power consolidated throughout the Mediterranean and established the political unity that would characterize the ancient world for centuries, the Phoenician contribution to this achievement remained embedded in countless aspects of imperial organization and cultural development. Though their distinctive political identity had been eliminated, their influence persisted through the practical knowledge, cultural innovations, and institutional precedents that they had bequeathed to subsequent civilizations. The story of the Phoenicians thus concluded not with dramatic defeat or cultural extinction, but with absorption into the broader synthesis of Mediterranean civilization that their own activities had helped to create. The networks they had established, the connections they had fostered, and the innovations they had developed had made possible the very imperial unity that ultimately eliminated their independence. Their legacy lived on in every letter of the alphabet that recorded Roman laws and literature, in every commercial transaction that followed principles they had pioneered, in every voyage that relied on navigational techniques they had perfected. The civilization that had taught the ancient world to read and write, to navigate distant seas, and to create prosperity through voluntary cooperation, had given birth to achievements that transcended the limitations of any single culture or political system. In the gentle lapping of Mediterranean waves against harbours they had built, in the evening calls of merchants using words derived from languages they had spread, in the purple sunset that recalled the dye that had made them famous throughout the ancient world, the influence of the Phoenicians continued long after their ships had disappeared from the wine-dark seas they had once ruled as their own. The final echoes of Phoenician civilization resonated not in the crash of falling stones or the cries of the conquered, but in the quiet persistence of knowledge that had become so fundamental to human development that its origins were already fading into the realm of half-remembered legend. As Roman legions marched through the smoking ruins of Carthage and Roman administrators began the methodical process of erasing the last vestiges of Phoenician political identity, the true measure of what this remarkable people had achieved was becoming apparent in ways that even they might not have fully understood. For the Phoenicians had accomplished something far more enduring than the conquest of territories or the accumulation of wealth. They had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization itself, creating innovations and establishing patterns of cultural exchange that would influence every subsequent chapter of Mediterranean and world history. Their most profound achievement lay not in what they had built for themselves, but in what they had made possible for others. The alphabet that had emerged from their practical need to communicate across language barriers had by now spread throughout the known world, adapting to the phonetic requirements of dozens of different tongues while maintaining the essential simplicity that had made it revolutionary. Greek philosophers used Phoenician-derived letters to record their investigations into the nature of reality. Roman administrators employed the same system to codify the laws that would govern their expanding empire. Celtic Druids in distant Britain, Persian scribes in the eastern satrapies, and Egyptian priests along the Nile all used variations of the writing system that Phoenician merchants had perfected in their busy warehouses and crowded marketplaces. This democratization of literacy had unleashed intellectual and cultural developments that rippled through every level of ancient society. Where once the ability to read and write had been the exclusive privilege of priestly and administrative elites, now farmers could maintain their own records, craftsmen could preserve technical knowledge, and ordinary citizens could participate in the written culture that was transforming human consciousness. The Phoenician gift of alphabetic writing had broken the monopoly that ruling classes had maintained over information and knowledge, creating possibilities for intellectual development that would have been unimaginable in earlier eras. The commercial practices that Phoenician merchants had developed to manage their far-flung trading networks had become the foundation for economic relationships throughout the ancient world. The standardized weights and measures that had facilitated transactions between different cultures, the contractual arrangements that had enabled complex partnerships across vast distances, the banking systems that had allowed merchants to transfer value without transporting precious metals through dangerous territories. All of these innovations had been absorbed into the economic systems of successor civilizations. Roman merchants conducting business in Germania used techniques that had been pioneered by Phoenician traders in Spain. Greek colonists establishing settlements around the Black Sea employed organizational methods that had been developed in Carthaginian territories. Persian administrators managing the complex logistics of imperial governance relied on record-keeping systems that traced their origins to Phoenician commercial practices. The navigational knowledge that had enabled Phoenician ships to venture confidently into previously unknown waters had become the inheritance of every maritime civilization that followed. The techniques for reading weather patterns, interpreting coastal signs, and using celestial observations to determine position and direction had been transmitted through countless generations of sailors and explorers who carried this accumulated wisdom into new seas and unknown territories. When Roman fleets crossed the Channel to invade Britain, they relied on sailing directions that ultimately derived from Phoenician explorations. When Greek navigators ventured into the Black Sea or established colonies along the African coast, they used methods that had been perfected through centuries of Phoenician maritime experience. The very concept of systematic exploration, of treating the sea as a highway rather than a barrier, reflected the fundamental shift in human perspective that Phoenician achievements had made possible. The urban planning principles that had governed the construction of Phoenician cities continued to influence Mediterranean development long after their political independence had ended. The integration of commercial, residential, and religious areas within carefully planned urban environments, the provision of adequate water supplies and drainage systems, the creation of public spaces that could accommodate diverse community activities. All of these innovations had become standard features of well-designed cities throughout the ancient world. Roman colonial cities from Britain to North Africa incorporated design elements that had been pioneered in Phoenician settlements. The forum complexes that anchored Roman urban life reflected organizational principles that had been developed in Phoenician marketplaces. The harbour facilities that enabled Roman maritime commerce employed engineering techniques that had been perfected by Phoenician builders working under challenging environmental conditions. Perhaps most significantly, the Phoenicians had demonstrated that prosperity and cultural achievement could be built on voluntary cooperation rather than conquest, on mutual benefit rather than domination, on cultural synthesis rather than cultural imperialism. This model of civilization, while ultimately overwhelmed by more militaristic approaches to empire building, had established precedents and created expectations that would continue to influence human development for millennia. The religious tolerance that had enabled Phoenician communities to adapt to diverse cultural environments had shown that different peoples could coexist peacefully while maintaining their distinctive identities. The commercial networks that had connected disparate civilizations had demonstrated the benefits of cultural exchange and technological transfer. The colonial policies that had integrated indigenous populations as partners rather than subjects had provided models for successful governance that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. These achievements represented more than historical curiosities or footnotes to the story of more politically successful civilizations. They embodied alternative possibilities for human organization and development that would resurface throughout subsequent history whenever circumstances created opportunities for their application. The Phoenician example would inspire medieval merchants who created trading networks across Europe and Asia. It would influence Renaissance explorers who ventured into unknown oceans seeking new routes to distant markets. It would provide precedents for modern concepts of international cooperation and cultural exchange. The technological innovations that had emerged from Phoenician workshops and laboratories had become integral parts of the technical knowledge that successor civilizations inherited and developed further. The metallurgical techniques that had produced superior weapons and tools, the construction methods that had created harbors and fortifications capable of withstanding the most challenging conditions, the manufacturing processes that had created goods prized throughout the ancient world. All of these achievements had been absorbed into the broader stream of human technological development. Roman engineers building aqueducts and roads employed principles that had been developed by Phoenician builders. Greek craftsmen working with metals and textiles used techniques that had been perfected in Phoenician workshops. Persian administrators organizing large-scale construction projects relied on logistical methods that had been pioneered by Phoenician merchants managing complex commercial operations. The artistic traditions that had flourished under Phoenician patronage continued to influence Mediterranean cultural development through the countless objects, buildings, and decorative programs that had been created during their centuries of prosperity. The synthesis of diverse artistic traditions that had characterized Phoenician civilization had established aesthetic principles and decorative vocabularies that would continue to inspire artists and craftsmen throughout the ancient world. The influence of Phoenician artistic achievements could be seen in the decorative programs of Roman buildings, in the design motifs that appeared on Greek pottery, in the ornamental traditions that developed throughout the Hellenistic world. The cosmopolitan aesthetic that had emerged from Phoenician cultural synthesis had become part of the visual language of Mediterranean civilization itself, as the last elderly merchants who remembered independent Phoenician cities passed away in Roman territories, and as the final speakers of Punic gradually adopted Latin in their daily conversations, the distinctive cultural identity that had sustained this remarkable civilization for over 1,000 years finally dissolved into the broader synthesis of imperial Roman culture. Yet this absorption represented not defeat, but fulfillment, not ending, but transformation. The Phoenicians had achieved something far more enduring than political survival. They had fundamentally altered the course of human development, creating innovations and establishing patterns of cultural exchange that would influence every subsequent civilization. Their cities might lie in ruins, their ships might no longer sail the Mediterranean, their language might survive only in scholarly texts, but their true legacy lived on in every aspect of the interconnected world that their achievements had made possible. In the quiet libraries where Roman scholars copied manuscripts using alphabetic writing, in the busy marketplaces where merchants from distant lands conducted business according to standardized practices, in the workshops where craftsmen applied techniques learned from masters whose knowledge traced back through generations of Phoenician innovation, the influence of this remarkable people continued to shape human civilization in ways both profound and permanent. The networks they had created had become the foundation for the political and economic unity that would characterize the Roman Empire. The knowledge they had accumulated had become part of the intellectual inheritance that would be preserved and transmitted through the long centuries of ancient and medieval history. The innovations they had pioneered had become so fundamental to human civilization that their origins were forgotten, even as their influence persisted. And so the Phoenicians passed into history not as a conquered people whose achievements had been destroyed, but as a civilization whose greatest triumphs had become inseparable from the progress of humanity itself. They had taught the world to read and write, to navigate distant seas, to create prosperity through cooperation rather than conquest. They had demonstrated that human ingenuity and cultural flexibility could overcome the limitations imposed by geography, politics, and ethnic division. Their story reminds us that the most enduring achievements of human civilization often come not from those who build the mightiest armies or construct the most impressive monuments, but from those who create the tools and systems that enable others to achieve greatness. The Phoenicians had given humanity the alphabet that would record the thoughts of philosophers and poets, the commercial practices that would enable the prosperity of nations, the navigational techniques that would make possible the exploration of new worlds. As you drift towards sleep, carried by the gentle rhythm of waves that once bore Phoenician ships across the Mediterranean, their legacy continues in every word you read, every connection you make across cultural boundaries, every journey you take into unknown territories. The purple-sailed vessels may have vanished from ancient seas, but the currents they set in motion flow still, carrying forward the enduring influence of a people who transformed the world not through conquest, but through the patient work of connection, innovation, and the generous sharing of knowledge that would outlive empires and echo through the ages. In the end, the Phoenicians achieved the only immortality that truly matters. They became part of the story of humanity itself, woven so deeply into the fabric of human development that their influence will persist as long as people read and write, trade and explore, build cities and cross oceans in search of knowledge and opportunity. The twilight that claimed their political independence was also the dawn of their eternal legacy, spreading like alphabetic letters across the pages of history, carrying their gifts forward into every chapter of human achievement that would follow.